Tonight, we're diving into the complete history of Harry Potter's Death Eaters and the rise of Voldemort's secret army. This is a fascinating topic, but I'll keep my narration calm to ensure you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Imagine a shadow stretching across the wizarding world, a darkness so profound that for 11 years, people were afraid to even speak the name of the man who cast it. We often think of Lord Voldemort as a singular entity of evil, a dark wizard acting alone in his pursuit of immortality. But the true terror of his reign didn't just come from his personal power. It came from the silent, masked figures standing behind him. The Death Eaters were more than just a gang of criminals or a group of loyalists. They were a sophisticated terror network, a political machine, and a cult of personality that nearly toppled one of the oldest magical governments in existence. They were the neighbours you thought you knew, the high-ranking officials in the Ministry of Magic, and the wealthy aristocrats who funded the very society they sought to destroy. To understand the Death Eaters is to understand the darkest corners of the human soul. Why would a talented young witch or wizard choose to brand their arm with a skull and a serpent? Why would they trade their freedom and their identity for a life of servitude to a master who viewed them as nothing more than disposable tools? The story of the Death Eaters is a chilling study in how extremism takes root. It begins not with a war, but with a group of ambitious students at Hogwarts in the 1940s, gathered around a charismatic and brilliant boy named Tom Riddle. These early followers weren't called Death Eaters yet. They were a collection of the clever, the cruel, and the lost, all looking for a sense of belonging and a path to power. They were the seeds of a movement that would eventually lead to the deaths of countless innocents and the scarring of an entire generation. We often focus on the battles, the flashes of green light, and the spectacular duels. But the real power of the Death Eaters lay in the psychological warfare they waged. They understood that fear is more effective than any curse. By wearing masks and hoods, they became a faceless monolith, an unstoppable force that could be anyone and anywhere. They utilized the Imperius curse to turn friends against one another, ensuring that no one knew who could be trusted. They targeted the vulnerable, exploited ancient prejudices about blood purity, and promised a world where the strong could rule without the constraints of law or morality. This wasn't just a quest for magical dominance, it was a crusade to reshape the very fabric of wizarding society into something unrecognizable and cruel. As we journey through this history, we have to look at the hierarchy that sustained this army. At the top sat Voldemort, the absolute dictator who demanded total subservience. Below him was the inner circle, the elite few who bore the dark mark and were granted the privilege of being tortured by their master for their failures. These individuals, like Bellatrix Lestrange and Lucius Malfoy, represent the different faces of the movement, the fanatical believer and the opportunistic aristocrat. Then there were the outer circles, the sympathizers, the coerced and the spies. The tragedy of the Death Eaters is that their influence touched everyone, from the highest levels of the Winsgamot to the youngest students in the Slytherin common room. It was a poison that seeped into the ground of the wizarding world, one that would take decades to wash away. The stakes were never just about who held a wand or who sat in the minister's office. The stakes were the soul of the magical community. Would it be a society defined by inclusion, bravery, and the protection of the weak, or would it succumb to a philosophy of might makes right and the preservation of pure blood at any cost? The Death Eaters were the physical manifestation of that darker choice. They were the architects of a reign of terror that saw the disappearance of families, the infiltration of Hogwarts, and the systematic dismantling of civil liberties. Their story is one of betrayal, of friends betraying friends, of students betraying teachers, and of a society nearly betraying its own values in the face of overwhelming fear. There is a deep mystery at the heart of this organization. How did they survive after their master's first fall in 1981? How did a group so feared and so hated manage to melt back into society, claiming they were under a spell only to rise again with even more ferocity 14 years later? This speaks to the failure of justice and the persistence of the very ideologies Voldemort championed. It highlights the complacency of a government that wanted to believe the nightmare was over. even as the dark marks on the arms of their citizens began to itch and darken once more. The return of the Death Eaters in the mid-90s wasn't just a military comeback, it was a resurrection of a hatred that had never truly gone away. Tonight, we are going to peel back the masks. We will look at the rituals, the symbolism of the Dark Mark, and the specific tactics used during both the First and Second Wizarding Wars. We will explore the biographies of the most notorious members, from the calculated brilliance of Severus Snape to the tragic descent of Regulus Black. We will examine the key battles, from the shadowy skirmishes in the 1970s to the climactic, world-shaking confrontation at the Battle of Hogwarts. We will see how they manipulated the press, how they turned the Ministry of Magic into a tool of oppression, and how they were ultimately undone not just by superior magic, but by the very things they despised: love, loyalty, and the courage of those who refuse to be afraid. This is a deep dive into the archives of the wizarding world's darkest era. It is a chronicle of a secret army that operated in the light of day and the dead of night, leaving a trail of broken lives and a legacy that still haunts the halls of Hogwarts. As we begin this journey, let the world around you fade away. Let the flickering torches of the Great Hall and the cold mist of the Forbidden Forest fill your mind. We are going back to the beginning, to the birth of a Dark Lord and the assembly of the men and women who chose to follow him into the abyss. This is the complete untold history of the Death Eaters. There is a moment in every great darkness that marks the beginning of a pattern, a single point where the thread of destiny first frays. For the Death Eaters, that moment did not begin in a shadowy meeting of robed figures, nor in a grand hall of pure-blood aristocracy, but in a small, cold room in a London orphanage where a boy sat alone, watching the world through windows that were never quite clean. That boy was Tom Marvolo Riddle, and before he became the most feared wizard of his age, before the dark mark burned in the sky over graveyards and ministries, he was simply a child who had learned one terrible truth. That power was the only thing that could protect him from the cruelty of others. The psychological foundations of the boy, who would become Lord Voldemort, were laid in the isolation of Wool's Orphanage, a grim institution on the outskirts of London. Tom Riddle arrived there as an infant, left by a mother who died in childbirth and a father who had abandoned them both before he was even born. He grew up among children who were not his own, among caretakers who were efficient but never warm, among walls that were always damp no matter the season. He did not know love, he did not know trust. What he knew, what he learned from his earliest memories, was that the world was a place of threats, and that the only way to survive was to make others afraid. And it was in that orphanage that the first signs of his extraordinary nature began to surface. Strange things would happen when Tom Riddle was angry. Toys that belonged to other children would vanish, only to be found broken in odd places. The boy who had bullied him near the river would later claim to have seen something terrible in the dark, something that had chased him through the reeds. The orphanage matron, Mrs. Cole, knew that there was something wrong with the child. Something she could not explain but could not ignore. She described him as secretive, with an almost adult intensity, and she had long since learned to avoid crossing him. He was not a boy who asked for things. He was a boy who took them, and he did so without a word. How early childhood isolation at Wool's Orphanage fueled a desire for absolute control becomes clear when we look at the way Tom Riddle viewed his own abilities. He did not discover magic as a gift to be shared or a wonder to be understood. He discovered it as a weapon. The first time he made a boy's pet rabbit hang itself from the ceiling of the shed, he did not feel remorse. He felt power. He felt the intoxicating realization that he could reach beyond the limits of his own small body, that he could make the world bend to his will. That was the moment when the discovery of magic as a tool for dominance rather than connection took root in him. It was never about wonder. It was always about control. When Albus Dumbledore first visited Wool's Orphanage to tell Tom Riddle that he was a wizard, he found a boy who was already suspicious, already guarded, already calculating. Dumbledore offered him a way out of the orphanage, a path to a place where he would belong. But Tom Riddle did not want to belong. He wanted to ascend. He accepted the invitation to Hogwarts, but he saw it not as a school, but as a training ground. He saw the wizarding world as a realm of hidden power waiting to be conquered. And the first thing he did when he arrived at Hogwarts was to begin gathering information about blood purity, about lost magical arts, about the legacy of Salazar's Slytherin. He did not make friends, he made followers. The initial formation of a gang at Hogwarts that served as the prototype for the Death Eaters happened slowly, steadily, and almost entirely unnoticed by the faculty. Tom Riddle was charming when he wanted to be. He had a way of speaking that made his listeners feel chosen exceptional, as though they were being let in on a secret that only the worthy could understand. He found his first recruits among the older Slytherins, the ones who already held a sense of superiority based on their lineage. But he also found them among the overlooked, the bitter, the ambitious, those who lacked power and hungered for it. He promised them a place in a new order, a world where their blood and their loyalty would be rewarded. He did not call them Death Eaters then. They were simply his inner circle, his Knights of Walpurgis, a name that carried the weight of ancient magic and dark ambition. These early followers did not yet wear masks or bear the dark mark. They were students, still learning, still testing the limits of what they could do. They met in secret, in the dungeons and the abandoned classrooms, and they whispered about the things they had learned. Spells the teachers would not teach, curses that left no mark on the body, but shattered the mind. Tom Riddle led them not with charisma alone, but with an unyielding authority that made dissent feel like betrayal. He was never cruel to them without reason, but he was never kind without purpose. Every interaction was a transaction. Every favour was a debt, and it was during this time that he began to understand the deeper truths of the magical world. Truths about Horcruxes, about immortality, about the fragments of soul that could be torn away and hidden. He did not share these secrets with his followers. He was already learning that power must be hoarded, never given. The Knights of Walpurgis were useful, but they were not equals. They were the first rungs on a ladder he intended to climb alone. The shadow of Tom Riddle grew longer as the years passed at Hogwarts. By his 5th year, he had already opened the Chamber of Secrets, unleashed the Basilisk, and framed Rubeus Hagrid for the death of Myrtle Warren. It was a demonstration of power, a warning that he was not to be challenged, and a rehearsal for the kind of terror he would later inflict on the entire wizarding world. He left Hogwarts with a group of devoted followers, with a reputation for brilliance and danger, and with a plan that would take decades to fully unfold. What happened next in the years after he left the castle is the story of how a gang of schoolyard supporters became a terror network that would plunge Britain into war. It is the story of how the Knights of Walpurgis evolved into something far more organised, far more sinister, and far more deadly. It is the story of the first generation of Death Eaters, and it begins with a man who had learned, in the loneliness of an orphanage, that the only way to be safe was to make everyone else afraid. In the next chapter, we will look closely at those earliest followers, the ones who stood beside Tom Riddle, before he was Lord Voldemort, before the dark mark was branded into their flesh. We will see how the Knights of Walpurgis laid the groundwork for the army of terror that would later follow him to the brink of defeat and back again. That chapter is called The Knights of Walpurgis, and it holds the seeds of everything that was to come. By the time Tom Riddle had finished his 5th year at Hogwarts, his reputation was already something altogether more dangerous than the typical schoolyard bully. The boys who had once followed him in simple acts of intimidation. A hex here, a stolen heirloom there, had been replaced by something far more deliberate. He had begun to shape them, to sharpen their ambitions into a single unforgiving blade. And it was in the spring of 1943 that the first true seed of what would become the Death Eaters was planted. The name itself was a secret, whispered only among those who had earned the right to speak it. They called themselves the Knights of Walpurgis. Walpurgis Night, as any student of dark folklore would know, is the night of April 30th, a time when witches were said to gather on the Brocken Mountain in Germany, dancing with the devil himself. It was a name that evoked ancient rituals, hidden gatherings, and the promise of power beyond the ordinary. Tom Riddle, with his instinct for theatrical symbolism, understood exactly what he was doing. He was not simply forming a club. He was creating a myth, a secret society that would outlast his own time at school. The transition from loose gang of admirers to a formal, secretive organisation was gradual but deliberate. Riddle did not rush. He watched, he evaluated, and he chose only those who could be moulded into weapons. The first generation of knights included 3 names that would echo through the decades: Lestrange, Rosier, and Avery. Rodolphus Lestrange was not yet the man who would later torture the Longbottoms into madness. But he came from a family steeped in pure blood pride and dark magic. He was eager to prove himself, to step out of the shadow of his ancestors. Theodore Rozier was quieter, more intellectual, but equally devoted to the cause of purity and power. And Avery, a surname that would later be carried by a Death Eater who failed to retrieve the prophecy, was an early convert, drawn by Riddle's charisma and the promise of a world where bloodlines mattered above all else. But here is where the irony of Tom Riddle's entire project becomes most striking. He was himself a half-blood, the son of a Muggle father and a witch mother, yet he preached pure blood supremacy with the zeal of a convert, manipulating the very prejudices that would have excluded him if his true origins were known. He crafted a narrative that separated himself from his own past, telling his followers that he was the heir of Salazar Slytherin, that his mother's blood was pure, and that his father had been irrelevant. He did not lie outright. He simply omitted the uncomfortable truth. And because he was so talented, so powerful, and so utterly convincing, the pure blood families of Slytherin saw in him what they wanted to see, a leader who would restore their ancient superiority. The Knights of Walpurgis met in secret, in hidden corners of the castle, in the Room of Requirement, or deep within the Slytherin common room after the torches had been extinguished. They discussed dark magic, the subjugation of Muggle-borns, and the necessity of wizarding dominance. Riddle taught them spells that were not on the curriculum, and they practiced them in the dead of night. There was a ritualistic quality to their gatherings, a sense of initiation and belonging that bound them together more tightly than any friendship. They were no longer just schoolboys. They were an order, a vanguard for a revolution that had not yet begun. And yet, even in those early days, Riddle kept his closest secrets to himself. He never revealed his own fear of death, his obsession with immortality, or the fact that he was already experimenting with Horcruxes. The Knights were tools, not confidants. He used their loyalty to build a network that would serve him beyond Hogwarts. But he never let them see the full extent of his ambition. That was the pattern that would define the Death Eaters for decades to come. A hierarchy built on fear and devotion, with Voldemort, alone at the centre, always holding the final pieces of the puzzle. As the end of his 7th year approached, Tom Riddle prepared to leave Hogwarts, but the Knights of Walpurgis were not disbanded. They would remain a secret society that would evolve into something far more terrible. The philosophy that held them together, the belief in pure blood supremacy and the rejection of all that was not wizard-born, would soon be codified into a doctrine of terror. That doctrine and the twisted logic that made it seem noble to its followers would become the foundation of everything the Death Eaters stood for. And understanding that philosophy, the ideas that turned hatred into a cause, is essential to understanding how Tom Riddle transformed a handful of schoolyard thugs into an army that would nearly tear the wizarding world apart. That is the subject of our next chapter, the philosophy of blood purity. From the secret meetings of the Knights of Walpurgis, that name conjuring images of dark Sabbaths and forbidden rites, the transition to something far more permanent was inevitable. But what truly transformed a collection of schoolyard sycophants into a domestic terrorist network was not merely Tom Riddle's charisma or his hunger for power. It was the gradual, insidious construction of a philosophy that could justify any atrocity, and at its core lay a single seductive idea: the purity of blood. The concept of blood purity did not originate with Tom Riddle. It had been simmering within the wizarding world for centuries, a prejudice born from fear and a desire to preserve an ancient magical heritage. Wizards who married Muggles or Muggle-borns were looked down upon by some old families, and the term mudblood had been used as a slur long before Riddle ever spoke it. But he did not simply adopt this prejudice, he weaponized it. He transformed a social bias into a theological absolute. To understand the Death Eaters, you must understand how they came to see themselves not as villains, but as liberators. And that liberation began with the redefinition of what they called the magic Mostiaville. The phrase itself appears in a book that exists only in the deepest vaults of restricted libraries, a text that catalogues the darkest magical arts. But for the Death Eaters, the magic Mostiaville was not a specific spell or ritual. It was the fundamental corruption of wizarding society by those they considered unworthy. They argued that Muggleborns diluted the bloodline, that their magic was a fluke, a theft from pure blood families, and they believed that allowing such weak, impure magic to persist was the true evil. So their mission became a kind of purification, a cleansing of the magical world from the inside. This is how the radicalization of the wizarding elite occurred. Not overnight, but through repeated, whispered justifications in drawing rooms and common rooms, until murder became a sacred duty. Salazar Slytherin's legacy was the perfect vessel for this ideology. He had built a hidden chamber, seeded it with a monster, and left behind a message. Only his true heir could open it and purge the school of those unworthy to study magic. For centuries, that legacy had been treated as a dark myth, a cautionary tale. But Tom Riddle saw it as a blueprint. He did not merely resurrect the Chamber of Secrets. He resurrected Slytherin's entire worldview, updating it for a modern era of terror. The weaponization of that legacy gave the Death Eaters a historical legitimacy they desperately needed. They were not a new movement, they claimed. They were the true voice of an ancient founder finally speaking after a millennium of silence. The fact that Slytherin's own house had produced Muggle-born defenders and many good witches and wizards was conveniently ignored. The narrative had to be pure, absolute, and unassailable, and so the Death Eaters began to see themselves as liberators. Liberators of wizarding culture from the shackles of Muggle influence, from electricity and plumbing and the slow erosion of magical traditions. Liberators of the pureblood families from the shame of marrying beneath them. Liberators of the very concept of magic from what they called the taint of the non-magical. This is a crucial point. They did not view their actions as terrorism. In their minds, they were waging a just war against an invasion. The Muggle-borns and their sympathizers were the enemy, an alien force that had infiltrated their sacred world. Every murder, every torture, every curse, cast in the name of blood purity, was an act of defense, a necessary surgery to save the body of wizarding society. It is a grotesque parody of patriotism, but it gave them a moral framework that allowed even the most cowardly followers to feel righteous. For the inner circle, however, there was an even more potent allure, the promise of belonging to an exclusive brotherhood of superior beings. The Death Eaters were not merely a political faction, they were a secret society with initiations, symbols, and ranks. To be branded with the Dark Mark was to be marked as one of the chosen, a trusted soldier of the most powerful wizard in history. That mark was a badge of honor, but it was also a shackle. It bound you to Voldemort's will, yet it also gave you access to knowledge, protection, and a sense of shared purpose that many pure blood families, particularly the younger generation, had never felt before. The psychological allure of that inner circle cannot be overstated. When a young Bellatrix Black, already steeped in pure blood dogma, knelt before Lord Voldemort, she was not surrendering her identity, she was finally finding it. Years of repressed arrogance, of being told that her family name was important, but that the wizarding world was changing, all melted into a single burning loyalty. And for those who might have hesitated, the alternative was terrifying. Voldemort demanded absolute devotion. Refusal meant death or worse. But the philosophy of blood purity gave them a reason to embrace their fear. They could tell themselves, "I am not a coward, I am a defender of my heritage." This self-deception is the glue that held the Death Eaters together, even when their master seemed lost forever. When Voldemort fell in 1981, many of his followers claimed they had been under the Imperius curse. But that was only a story they told themselves. The truth is that the ideology was so deeply ingrained that even without him they continued to believe, they continued to hide, to hoard dark artifacts, to pass their prejudices to their children. The seeds of the Second War were planted in those quiet years of denial. But to understand how that ideology became a physical binding force, you have to look at the symbol that cemented their loyalty. The Dark Mark. That mark was not merely a summoning device. It was a promise of eternal belonging, a scar that could never be erased. And in the next chapter, we will explore exactly how that brand was created, what it meant to those who wore it, and how a simple tattoo became the most feared emblem in the wizarding world. The mark itself carries a story, and it begins with a ritual that bound the Death Eaters to their master, as surely as the Horcruxes bound his soul to the earth. The ideology of blood purity was never just a set of abstract beliefs. It was a weapon forged in the fires of Salazar Slytherin's pride, and wielded by Tom Riddle to divide the wizarding world. But dividing people was only the first step. To truly command, Voldemort needed a symbol that would terrify his enemies and bind his followers more tightly than any oath. He needed a brand that would mark a person for life, a mark that could summon them from across the country, a mark that would burn with his own rising power. That mark was the Dark Mark, and it was not merely a tattoo. It was one of the most sophisticated and cruel magical instruments ever devised. To understand the Dark Mark, we have to look at the spell that powers it. It is not a simple charm of ignition or a cosmetic enchantment. The Dark Mark is linked to a protean charm. That is the same branch of magic Hermione Granger would later use to enchant fake galleons for Dumbledore's army. The protean charm allows objects to be magically connected so that changes made to one are replicated across all others. But Voldemort's application was far more invasive and permanent. He did not enchant a coin or a piece of parchment. He enchanted the living flesh of his followers. The Dark Mark was a permanent protean link etched into the left forearm of every inner circle Death Eater. When Voldemort touched his own mark, all other marks would heat and burn and shift, turning the skull and snake into a fiery summons that could be felt no matter where the wearer was hiding. The charm worked through a network of sympathetic magic, each marker node in a web centered on the Dark Lord himself. It meant that no Death Eater could ever truly escape. The mark would always know where they were, and the mark would always obey Voldemort's command. But the protean mechanics were only half the horror. The visual design of the Dark Mark was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It was a skull, the universal symbol of death, with a serpent emerging from its mouth instead of a tongue. The serpent is the emblem of Slytherin House, the creature of cunning and ambition. But placed inside the skull, it became something far more threatening. It suggested that death itself spoke through the snake, that Voldemort's will was the voice of the grave. The image was simple enough to be recognizable from a distance, yet detailed enough to be deeply unsettling. When the Dark Mark was conjured in the sky over a house or a village, it glowed an eerie green, the color of the killing curse. It was not just a symbol of allegiance, it was a promise. It told everyone who saw it that death was near, that the Death Eaters had been there, and that no one was safe. The mark in the sky was a terror weapon, designed to break morale long before any actual violence occurred. Yet for the Death Eaters themselves, the brand on their arm carried a double meaning. On the surface, it was a badge of honor. To be marked was to be chosen. It signified that you were part of the inner circle, trusted with Voldemort's secrets, worthy of his attention. In the early days of the First Wizarding War, Death Eaters would show their marks with pride, rolling up their sleeves in dark taverns to prove their loyalty. It was a mark of belonging to something powerful and feared. But that honor came with a permanent leash. The same magic that summoned them could also burn them. The Dark Mark made desertion nearly impossible. If you tried to flee, if you tried to deny your allegiance, Voldemort could activate the mark at any moment. The pain was not just physical, it was a reminder of the bond that could never be broken. And if the Dark Lord suspected treachery, the mark could be used to torture or even to track. It was a collar disguised as a crown. The physical sensation of the mark activating is described in chilling detail when Voldemort returns in the graveyard at Little Hangleton. The Death Eaters who had been summoned felt their arms suddenly burn. The mark turned jet black and began to writhe under the skin. For those who had been hiding, pretending they were no longer loyal, the pain was a shock that announced the return of their master, and the intensity of the burning corresponded to Voldemort's own power. When he was weak, the marks were pale and dormant. When he was rising, they grew darker and hotter. This meant the Death Eaters could feel their master's life force through their own flesh. They knew, without being told, when Voldemort was angry, when he was triumphant, when he was near. It was a bond that eroded individuality. Your arm was no longer just your arm. It was a part of Voldemort's body, a remote sensor, a homing beacon, a leash that could yank you from anywhere. And when the Dark Mark was conjured in the sky, it was not just a projection. The spell was tied to the same protean link. The green skull that appeared above a house or a hill was the collective signature of every marked Death Eater. It was a shared ghost, a phantom of their loyalty made visible. To see that mark in the sky was to know that Voldemort's followers were near, and that the terror was not random. It was organized. It was ritualized. It was part of a campaign designed to make people fear the very air. But the mark also had a more intimate, almost sacred function. When Voldemort touched the mark of a particular Death Eater, he could communicate directly, sending pain or commands that only that person would feel. In the Department of Mysteries, when Bellatrix Lestrange sensed that her master was calling, she knew exactly what to do. The mark was a private telephone line, wired into the nervous system. It allowed Voldemort to control his army with a single touch, a silent signal that could not be intercepted. It was the ultimate tool of a dictator who demanded not just obedience but constant presence. And yet, for all its power, the Dark Mark was also a vulnerability. When Voldemort fell in 1981, the marks on his followers' arms faded to a dull scar, barely visible. The Death Eaters who had been marked could feel that the bond was broken, that their master was gone. Many panicked. Many tried to burn the mark away, but it could not be removed. It remained as a ghost of their former loyalty, a permanent reminder of the terror they had served. In the years that followed, some tried to hide it, wearing long sleeves, or claiming they had been under the Imperius curse. But the mark never fully disappeared. It waited, dormant like a sleeping volcano. When Voldemort began to regain power in the early 1990s, the first sign was the marks growing darker. Wormtail, Peter Pettigrew, could feel his own arm starting to prickle. He knew what it meant. The mark was reawakening. The bond was being reforged. And when Voldemort finally summoned his followers to the graveyard, the burning was so intense that they could not ignore it. They had to come. They had no choice. The mark had turned from a scar into a beacon again. For the listener drifting off to sleep, think of the Dark Mark as a symbol of the price of blind allegiance. It was a brand that took away freedom and replaced it with a constant, low-grade threat of pain. It was a badge that could turn from honor to shame in an instant, and it was a piece of magic that blurred the line between the self and the master. The Death Eaters were not just followers. They were living pieces of Voldemort's own body. Their flesh was his tool. Their pain was his weapon. Their will was his to command. But the mark was not the only tool of terror. The Death Eaters also wore masks and robes that stripped away their individual identities, making them into faceless instruments of fear. In the next chapter, we will explore the tools of terror, masks and robes. How did a simple piece of cloth and a hood become as terrifying as the Dark Mark itself? How did the Death Eaters use costume to turn themselves into nightmares? That story is waiting for you. For now, let the image of that green skull fade into the darkness, leaving only the quiet understanding that some marks are never truly erased. The transformation from binding flesh to concealing cloth was not an accident. Once the Dark Mark had seared itself into the skin of Voldemort's inner circle, the next logical step was to shield that flesh from the eyes of the world. The robes and masks of the Death Eaters are often treated as a mere visual flourish in the story of the Wizarding War. But they are far more than that. They are a deliberate piece of engineering, a psychological weapon, and a ritual garment all at once. And their evolution from simple hoods to ornate, terrifying masks tells us a great deal about how Voldemort understood fear. In the very earliest days, when Tom Riddle was still gathering his Knights of Walpurgis, there was no uniform at all. Those first followers were Hogwarts students who met in secret corners of the castle, dressed in their ordinary school robes. They were recognizable to one another by shared glances and whispered passwords. Anonymity was not yet a priority because the group was small and the stakes were contained to schoolyard rivalries and dark experiments. But as Riddle's ambitions grew, and as the first generation of his followers left Hogwarts and entered the wider wizarding world, the need for concealment became acute. The wizarding community in Britain, as we have seen, is not a large population. It is an intimate, interconnected society where family names carry centuries of weight. You cannot walk into the Leaky Cauldron or Diagon Alley without being known, without your lineage being whispered about. For a group planning to commit murder, torture, and insurrection, being seen was a death sentence, and so the hoods came first. The earliest Death Eater uniforms were simple black robes with deep hoods that could be pulled forward to shadow the face entirely. There was nothing elaborate about them. They were functional, like the cloaks of medieval executioners, a dark, shapeless silhouette that left no distinguishing features visible. The idea was not to terrify but to survive. You could stand in a circle with your fellow conspirators, and if the ministry ever raided the meeting, you could pull up your hood and disappear into the night. No one could identify you by the cut of your robe, the colour of your hair, the shape of your jaw. You became a shape, a shadow, a non-person. That was the tactical advantage of anonymity in such a small society. The ministry could know that a group of dark wizards existed, but they could never pin faces to the crimes. The fear that built up in the public imagination was not yet directed at specific masks. It was directed at the very idea that anyone around you could be a Death Eater, hidden in plain sight under a hood. But as Voldemort's power grew, and as his followers became bolder, the simple hood began to feel insufficient. It was too modest. It hid, but it did not intimidate. There is a fundamental difference between concealment and terror. A hood can be pulled back. A mask, once it becomes a symbol, cannot be removed without consequence. It transforms the wearer into something other than human. And Voldemort understood that to rule through fear, his followers needed to become monsters, not just criminals. So the masks evolved. They became ornate, sculpted, grotesque, silver masks with slits for eyes and mouths, often shaped into expressions of malice or agony. Some masks were smooth and featureless, like a blank face, which is perhaps even more disturbing because you cannot read any emotion in it. Others were more elaborate, with ridges, spikes, or angular designs that evoked skulls or demons. The shift from hood to mask was a statement. We are no longer hiding, we are advertising our power. The material of the masks also mattered. In the films and descriptions from the books, the masks of the inner circle were crafted with a silver sheen, polished to a cold metallic finish. This was not random. Silver is a precious metal, associated with wealth and status. The masks were not cheap cloth, they were forged. That sent a message to both the public and the followers themselves. You were not just a thug in a hood, you were a knight in ritual armour. The masks became badges of honour within the Death Eater hierarchy. Only those trusted with the dark mark wore the full regalia. Lesser operatives, those who were used for menial tasks, or who had not yet proven their loyalty, might still wear simpler head coverings. The mask was a promotion, but the most important effect of the masks was what they did to the public psyche. The faceless nature of the group amplified paranoia to almost unbearable levels. Think about it. If a Death Eater's mask covered their face completely, you could never be sure if the person standing next to you, the ministry, the person serving you in a shop, the person sitting across from you at dinner, was actually a Death Eater who had simply not put on the mask yet. The mask became a second identity, and the first identity was hidden behind it. This created a climate of suspicion where nobody trusted anyone. Families turned against families. Friends suspected friends. The ministry's inability to catch Death Eaters was not just a failure of magical law enforcement. It was a direct consequence of the anonymity that the masks provided. A Death Eater could commit atrocities at night, then return to their comfortable home in a pure blood manner, and no one could prove anything. The mask was a wall between the crime and the criminal, and the masks served another purpose. They depersonalized the violence. When you wear a mask, you are no longer yourself. You are a representative of the cause. The moral weight of killing, torturing, and cursing is transferred from the individual to the collective symbol. It becomes easier to commit terrible acts because you are not the one doing them. The mask is doing them. This is a well-documented psychological phenomenon in real-world extremist groups, from the Ku Klux Klan to terrorist cells. The uniform disinhibits. It reduces the wearer's sense of personal responsibility. Voldemort, ever the master manipulator, knew this instinctively. He did not want his followers to think. He wanted them to act, and the masks helped them erase the part of themselves that might hesitate. Beyond the tactical and psychological dimensions, there was also the ritualistic aspect of the Death Eater gatherings. They did not meet in ordinary places. They gathered in remote, dark locations, forests at midnight, abandoned manor houses, graveyards, hidden chambers beneath old ruins. The masks were not just for combat, they were for ceremonies. When Voldemort summoned his followers, the circle would form, and the masks would turn toward him, identical and hollow. The uniformity of the masks created a visual harmony that reinforced the hierarchy. Voldemort alone stood unmasked. His face was fully visible, pale and serpentine, a stark contrast to the silver voids around him. He was the only individual. They were extensions of his will. The masks made them interchangeable, which was exactly how he wanted it. No Death Eater was indispensable. The mask could be filled by another. The identity was temporary. The symbol was eternal. Consider the scene at the graveyard in Little Hangleton. In the summer of 1995, Voldemort has just regained his body. He calls his Death Eaters to him, and they apparate into the circle. One by one, their masks glinting in the moonlight, they kneel, and they remove their masks, revealing their faces. That moment of unmasking is powerful because it shows the vulnerability beneath the terror. But when they stand again, they replace the masks, and they become once more the faceless army. The ritual of donning and removing the mask was part of the Dark Lord's theatre. The masks were not just tools. They were part of the liturgy of the Death Eater cult, and the robes themselves evolved alongside the masks. The early robes were simple and dark, but as the organisation grew more confident, the robes became more elaborate. High collars, flowing sleeves, heavy fabrics that moved like liquid shadow. The overall effect was to make the Death Eaters appear larger, more imposing, more otherworldly. They did not look like ordinary wizards. They looked like figures from a darker age, as if they had stepped out of a medieval tapestry of witchcraft and damnation. This aesthetic was deliberately cultivated to inspire awe and dread. In a society that prided itself on being modern, with electric lights and flue powder and comfortable homes, the Death Eaters looked like they belonged to a different time, a time of persecution and superstition. They were reminding the wizarding world that the old darkness had never really gone away. The masks also served a practical function in the field beyond anonymity. They could be enchanted. Some masks were imbued with protective charms, or with spells that distorted the wearer's voice, making it impossible to identify them by sound. The masks could be linked to the Dark Mark, so that when a Death Eater was in danger, the mask might gleam with a signal. They were not simple pieces of costume. They were magical artifacts in their own right, crafted by dark artisans who served the cause. But for all their power, the masks were also a weakness. They made the Death Eaters easier to spot. In the later battles, when the Ministry finally began to fight back, the silver masks were a liability. You could see a Death Eater coming from a distance. You could identify them as enemies, even in the chaos of a duel. The anonymity worked both ways. It protected the individual, but it exposed the group. And in the end, when Voldemort fell, the masks became symbols of shame. The survivors threw them away, hid them, destroyed them. They did not want to be associated with that face of terror anymore. The masks had outlived their purpose. The evolution from simple hoods to ornate masks mirrors the evolution of the Death Eaters themselves. They started as a secret society, hiding in shadows, and grew into a public terror organisation that wanted to be seen, wanted to be feared. The masks were the final step in that transformation. They took a group of individual wizards, each with their own ambitions and fears, and turned them into a single, faceless entity. An entity that could kill without remorse, that could torture without hesitation, that could stand in a circle under a dark sky and answer the call of a serpent-tongued master. And it was this entity, this masked army, that was now ready to unleash the first true war upon the wizarding world. The early 1970s were approaching, and Voldemort's power was no longer a rumour, it was a reality. Worn on the left arm and on the face, the masks were on, the hoods were pulled back. The time for hiding was over. The Death Eaters were about to step into the light of the first rise. And the wizarding world would never be the same again. The tools of terror were complete, and the hand that wielded them was reaching for the Ministry itself. The masks and robes we spoke of in the last chapter were more than just costumes. They were the first layer of a strategy that would soon grip all of wizarding Britain in a silent, creeping terror. By the early 1970s, Lord Voldemort had moulded his followers into something far deadlier than a gang of hooded thugs. The Death Eaters were becoming an organised, shadowy force that operated on two fronts simultaneously, one visible, one invisible. The visible front was violence, public murders, attacks on muggles, and the brutal enforcement of pure blood ideology. But the invisible front was where the real damage was done. It was a slow burn infiltration, a quiet corruption of the very institutions meant to protect the magical world. Let's start with the Ministry of Magic. At first, the Ministry dismissed the threat. They saw isolated incidents, a few missing Muggle-borns, a mysterious fire here, an unexplained death there, but they failed to see the pattern because the Death Eaters were already inside. They didn't need to storm the atrium with wands blazing. They sent their most charming, most respectable members to occupy desks in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the improper use of magic office, even the Wisengamot. These were men and women who came from old, pure-blood families, people with social standing and political connections. They didn't wear masks at work. They wore polite smiles and offered firm handshakes. They buried evidence, delayed investigations, and tipped off their fellow Death Eaters whenever an Auror got too close. One of the most insidious tools in this infiltration was the Imperius curse. The Ministry had no way to detect it reliably. An official under the Imperius would still go through the motions of their job, but their decisions were no longer their own. They would sign release orders for captured Death Eaters, approve transfers of dangerous magical artifacts, or simply look the other way when suspicious activity was reported. The curse spread like a contagion. It wasn't long before entire departments were compromised, not through force, but through control. A father under the Imperius might unknowingly betray his own son. An Auror might arrest an innocent colleague while letting a real Death Eater walk free. The threat was no longer just outside the Ministry walls. It was sitting at the next desk, sharing tea and smiling. And then there was the Daily Prophet. The newspaper of the wizarding world was supposed to be the light that exposed the darkness, but the Death Eaters understood that controlling information was just as powerful as controlling people. They didn't try to take over the Prophet directly at first. Instead, they placed their own people in key roles. Sub-editors who could kill a story, reporters who would accept bribes to write favourable pieces, and columnists who spread fear and misinformation. Whenever a Death Eater attack occurred, the Prophet would downplay it, blame it on rogue elements, or even suggest that the victims had provoked the violence. The public was slowly conditioned to distrust what they read, to question everything. Who could you believe when even the news was manipulated? The atmosphere of total distrust that defined the First Wizarding War was not an accident. It was engineered carefully and patiently over years. But the most terrifying aspect of this era was something the Ministry never officially acknowledged. They called them the Disappearances. People would vanish without a trace. A Muggle-born witch would leave her home to go shopping and never return. A half-blood family would be found with their house destroyed, but no bodies. An Auror investigating a lead would simply stop reporting in. At first, it was easy to dismiss as isolated incidents. Maybe they went into hiding, maybe they fled the country, but the pattern became undeniable. The Death Eaters had perfected the art of the kidnapping. They didn't just kill their enemies, they took them, sometimes for ransom, sometimes for interrogation, sometimes for the pure pleasure of making someone disappear. The method was horrifyingly simple. A team of masked Death Eaters would apparate into a home, seize their target, and disapparate before anyone could raise an alarm. They used polyjuice potion to impersonate ministry officials, luring victims into traps. They sent cursed letters that would transport the reader to a holding cell. They even used portkeys disguised as everyday objects. Once taken, the victims were never seen again, or if they were seen, it was only as tortured shells of their former selves, like the Longbottoms who were later found in St. Mungo's. The Disappearances sent a cold message: no one was safe. Not in their homes, not at work, not even in the middle of Diagon Alley, surrounded by dozens of witnesses. And perhaps the cruelest twist was the use of the Imperius curse to turn friends and family members against one another. Voldemort understood that the deepest wounds are not inflicted by strangers, but by those we trust. A Death Eater would place a parent under the Imperius, and that parent would then unknowingly lead a raid on their own child's safe house. A spouse would be controlled and forced to hand over the location of a resistance cell. A brother would be made to deliver his own sister to the Dark Lord. The resulting betrayal was not only physically devastating, it destroyed the very fabric of trust that held the wizarding community together. Families tore themselves apart. Long-standing friendships ended in suspicion. No one could look at a neighbour, a colleague, or even a loved one without wondering if they were still themselves, or if they were merely a puppet controlled by an unseen master. By the late 1970s, Britain's magical society was drowning in paranoia. The ministry was paralysed by infiltration. The Daily Prophet was a mouthpiece for half-truths and propaganda, and the disappearances continued, each one a reminder that the Death Eaters could strike anywhere, anytime, against anyone. The Order of the Phoenix fought back, but they were constantly outmaneuvered. Every victory came at a terrible cost, and Voldemort, from his hidden lair, watched it all unfold with cold satisfaction. He had not yet conquered the world, but he had already conquered its soul. Because fear is the most effective weapon of all. This was the world Harry Potter was born into in 1980, a world where trust was a luxury, where every shadow could hide a masked killer, and where the line between ally and enemy had been deliberately blurred. The First Wizarding War was not just a series of battles, it was a psychological war, a war of attrition against hope itself, and it would take a desperate act of love from a mother to finally break the cycle. But that is a story for another time. The architects of this misery were not the rank and file, Death Eaters who carried out the kidnappings or cast the Imperius curses. They were the inner circle, the Fanatics who sat at Voldemort's right hand, who shared his vision of blood purity and absolute power. Their names would become legends of terror: Bellatrix Lestrange, Lucius Malfoy, Severus Snape, though his story is far more complicated. In the next chapter, we will step into that inner sanctum and explore the minds of the most devoted, the most dangerous, and the most broken of Voldemort's followers. We will ask what drives a person to give up their very soul for a cause built on hatred. That chapter is called The Inner Circle, the Fanatics, and it will reveal the human heart of the darkness. For now, let the slow rhythm of this history settle around you, and remember, even in the darkest times, the light of a single mother's love could bring down the most powerful dark wizard of all time. Sleep well, and we will continue when you are ready. The Ministry of Magic was a fortress built on parchment and precedent, and the Death Eaters had found its weak points not with battering rams, but with quiet signatures and whispered suggestions. By the late 1970s, the Disappearances had become a systematic art form. Witches and wizards who stood against Voldemort did not simply die. They vanished from their homes, their workplaces, their very lives erased as if they had never existed. The Ministry's Auror department, already stretched thin, struggled to connect the dots between a missing half-blood here and a tortured muggle born there. And while the bureaucrats argued over jurisdiction, a more intimate kind of terror was being perfected by those who enjoyed their work a little too much. The Inner Circle was never a uniform body. It was a hierarchy of devotion, and at its apex stood those who had transcended mere loyalty into something closer to worship. These were the Fanatics, the ones who did not follow Voldemort because they feared him, but because they loved him. And among them, no one burned brighter or more destructively than Bellatrix Lestrange. Her story is not simply that of a woman who chose evil. It is a study in the transformation of a socialite into a weapon, a journey that began in the gilded drawing rooms of the noble and most ancient House of Black, and ended in the rubble of the Battle of Hogwarts, her wand still raised in defiance. Bellatrix was born, Bellatrix Black, the eldest daughter of Cygnus and Druella. The Blacks were pure-blood aristocracy, and Bellatrix was raised on a diet of supremacy, tradition, and the quiet belief that her family's bloodline made her better than most. She was beautiful, sharp-tongued and ambitious. In her youth, she could have been a society bride, a political hostess, or even a reformer. Instead, she met Tom Riddle. What she saw in him was not a half-blood orphan from a muggle woolen mill, but a force of nature that validated everything her family had ever whispered behind closed doors. He was the embodiment of pure-blood dominance, and she surrendered herself completely. Her marriage to Rodolphus Lestrange was a matter of family convenience, but it served a deeper purpose. It bound her to the Lestrange brothers, Rodolphus and Rabastan, two men who shared her fanaticism and her appetite for cruelty. The three of them became a unit within the Inner Circle, a squad that Voldemort deployed when he needed results that were not just efficient but savage. The Lestrange brothers were not subtle. They did not infiltrate or manipulate, they broke. Their role in the most brutal torture campaigns of the First Wizarding War is well documented in the Ministry's sealed files. But the full horror is known only to the survivors and the dead. One case stands above all others: the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom. In the months after Voldemort's first fall, when the Death Eaters were scattering and the Ministry was rounding up suspects, Bellatrix and the Lestranges believed that the Longbottoms knew the location of their master. They were wrong, but that did not stop them. Using the Cruciatus Curse, they tore into the minds of two of the most respected auras of the age. Frank and Alice Longbottom never recovered. They spent the rest of their lives in a hospital ward. Their sanity, Neville, growing up without parents who could recognize him. For Bellatrix, this was not a crime. It was an offering. And yet, even within this circle of extremists, there were those who specialized in a different kind of darkness. Antonin Dolohov did not need the brute force of the Lestranges. He was a craftsman of curses, a man who studied the flow of magic like a surgeon studies anatomy. Dolohov was known for developing unique, non-verbal, dark curses that left his victims with injuries the healers could not explain. His signature was a curse that, when cast silently, caused internal damage so severe that even Madame Pomfrey at Hogwarts struggled to reverse it. During the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, Dolohov proved his lethality by striking Hermione Granger with that very curse. She survived only because of quick intervention, but the scar it left on her chest was a reminder that not all dark magic relies on screaming the incantation. Dolohov was also a veteran of the First Wizarding War, having murdered Gideon and Fabian Pruitt, two of the Order's best fighters. He was a pragmatist, a killer who did not need the theatre of the Lestranges to get the job done. So why were the most loyal members often the most unstable? Because Voldemort did not recruit for mental health. He recruited for obsession. Bellatrix's devotion was not rational. It was a fixation that bordered on the pathological. She did not question his orders, did not flinch at his failures, and did not hesitate when he asked for the unthinkable. That kind of loyalty is a double-edged sword. It makes for a perfect soldier, but it also creates a follower who cannot adapt, who cannot think independently, and who is capable of self-destruction in the name of the cause. Bellatrix was not just unstable. She was a mirror reflecting everything Voldemort wanted his followers to be, and everything that would ultimately consume them. The Lestrange brothers shared that instability, but in a colder, more methodical way. Rodolphus was the quieter of the two, but his silence hid a reservoir of cruelty that matched his wife's. Rabastan was more volatile, quick to violence, and eager to prove himself. Together, they formed a triumvirate of terror that the Ministry could not break. Even after they were sentenced to Azkaban, the Dementors held them in name, but the madness of the prison only deepened their fixation. When Voldemort returned, they were among the first to break free, not because they had been rehabilitated, but because their insanity had calcified into a single unbreakable purpose. And then there was Barty Crouch Jr., a man who had been erased from the records, a ghost wearing a dead man's name. But his story belongs to the schemes of the Triwizard Tournament. For now, it is enough to say that the Inner Circle's fanatics were not a monolith. They were a collection of fierce, broken, brilliant and terrible individuals, each drawn to Voldemort for different reasons, but all united in their willingness to burn the world for his approval. As the sun set on the First War, the fanatics faced Azkaban, while the more pragmatic followers slipped away into the shadows. But the bonds of the Inner Circle were not easily severed. Those who had tasted the Dark Lord's favour would spend a decade in the cold, dreaming of the moment he would call them home. And when that moment came, the fanatics would be ready to lead the charge once more, their masks hiding faces that had long forgotten how to smile. It is no accident that the most dangerous Death Eaters were also the most unstable. Stability breeds hesitation, hesitation breeds survival. But in the cult of Voldemort, survival was secondary to service. And among the ranks of the Inner Circle, there was one figure who represented the aristocracy of darkness, a man whose wealth and influence gave him a different kind of power. He did not need to scream curses or carve the dark mark into the sky. He had the Ministry in his pocket, and he knew exactly how to use it. That story The story of the aristocrat who walked the tightrope between privilege and peril is one you will not want to miss when we turn to the next chapter. The previous chapter took us into the heart of fanaticism through Bellatrix Lestrange, a woman who abandoned every trace of her aristocratic upbringing for the raw, bloody devotion to her master. But while Bellatrix burned with a zeal that consumed all pretense, there existed another figure within the Death Eaters who represents an entirely different kind of darkness, the aristocrat, who never soiled his own hands, who never lost his social standing, and who used his gilded name as both a shield and a weapon. Lucius Malfoy was not born into the movement, he was raised to expect it. The Malfoy family had always understood that power does not come from brute force alone, but from the quiet accumulation of influence, from the strategic placement of gold in the right pockets, and from the careful maintenance of a reputation that could open any door in wizarding society. When Voldemort first began to gather followers in the 1970s, he recognized that he needed more than just desperate radicals and outcasts. He needed the Malfoys, a family whose wealth and political connections could provide the financial and political backbone of the entire movement. Lucius Malfoy understood that the path to ultimate control did not lie in shouting curses in the streets, but in the quiet whispers of committee rooms and the rustle of parchment signed in the most exclusive drawing rooms. The Malfoy fortune, accumulated over centuries of shrewd dealings and marriages of convenience, was not merely a stack of galleons in a vault. It was a liquid weapon that could be deployed to bribe officials, to purchase silence, to fund the acquisition of illegal artifacts, and to ensure that anti-dark magic legislation never made it past the first reading. Every time a bill threatened to restrict the sale of dark artifacts, or to impose stricter penalties on the use of the unforgivable curses, Lucius was there, pouring his old money into the hands of the right bureaucrats, hosting lavish dinners where the conversation was steered away from uncomfortable truths. He did not need to cast a single spell to sabotage the legal framework that would have crippled Voldemort's designs. His role as a recruiter among the wealthy and influential was equally subtle and devastating. When you are a Malfoy, you do not knock on doors, you send engraved invitations. Lucius cultivated a network of like-minded aristocrats, families such as the Knots, the Silfwinds, and the Greengrasses, who were already predisposed to believe in the natural superiority of pure blood lineage. He did not ask them to commit immediately to the Dark Lord. He simply planted seeds. He spoke in hushed tones about the erosion of tradition, about the influx of Muggle-borns diluting the ancient magic, about the need for strong leadership to restore order. For some, these conversations were enough to spark a genuine belief in the cause. For others, the appeal was purely social. A Malfoy gathering was the place to be seen, and to refuse his overtures risked exclusion from the most powerful circles. But there was always a tension between genuine belief in the cause and the desire for social preservation. Lucius himself embodied this conflict. On one level, he was a true believer in blood purity. His ancestry was his identity, and he genuinely despised those he considered beneath him. He had no moral qualms about the suffering inflicted on Muggle-borns or blood traitors. Yet, when the First War turned against Voldemort, when the Dark Lord disappeared in the aftermath of the killing that rebounded off Harry Potter, Lucius did not hesitate to claim that he had been under the Imperius curse. He retreated behind his wealth, his political connections, and his carefully cultivated reputation, escaping Azkaban when so many of his fellow Death Eaters were locked away. His devotion had limits, and those limits were drawn at the edge of his own comfort. This is the tragedy and the hypocrisy of the aristocratic Death Eater. They wanted the rewards of Voldemort's victory without the personal sacrifice. They wanted to rule a world purified of Muggle-borns, but they also wanted to keep their manicured gardens, their lavish parties, their positions on the board of Hogwarts. When Voldemort returned in the summer of 1994, Lucius was one of the first to crawl back, but with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. He had tasted freedom, and he had built a life of privilege that did not require the constant risk of being branded a terrorist. Yet the dark mark on his arm burned with an inescapable summons, and he could not refuse. The old money that had once funded Voldemort's rise now bought only a temporary reprieve from the Dark Lord's displeasure. The Malfoy family's influence during the Second War was more cautious, more calculating. Lucius focused on his seat on the Hogwarts Board of Governors, using his authority to push for policies that isolated Harry Potter and that allowed the school to be infiltrated. He also funneled resources to the ministry's most corrupt officials, ensuring that anti-dark magic legislation continued to be stymied. But the price of his return to the fold was his own son, Draco, who was forced into a mission that no father would willingly accept. The tension between belief and preservation finally tore the Malfoy family apart, and by the end, Lucius was more concerned with survival than with any vision of a pure-blood utopia. In many ways, Lucius Malfoy represents the most dangerous kind of Death Eater, the one who looks respectable, whose children attend the same schools as yours, who serves on charitable boards and donates to St. Mungo's. He proves that pure blood supremacy did not need to wear a mask and a hood to destroy lives. It could wear a tailored cloak and a polite smile, and it could open doors that violence could never breach. His influence is a reminder that the greatest enablers of evil are often those who profit from the chaos while pretending to abhor it. But while Malfoy played his careful game of political chess, another figure was preparing to walk a far more treacherous path. In the shadows of the Malfoy influence, a young man named Severus Snape was taking his first steps toward the Dark Lord, unaware that his journey would eventually lead him to become the most dangerous double agent the wizarding world would ever know. That story begins with an initiation born not of wealth, but of desperation and the cruel mathematics of a broken heart. From the gilded corridors of Malfoy Manor, where gold and influence bought silence, we now turn to a very different kind of initiation. Not one of inherited wealth or political maneuvering, but of a boy so poor, so unloved, and so clearly brilliant that his only path upward was through the darkest of arts. Severus Snape's story is not one of aristocratic privilege. It is a story of bitterness forged in a childhood of neglect and humiliation. And yet, that bitterness, channeled into an obsessive study of magic, would make him one of the most dangerous wizards of his generation. To understand how he became a Death Eater, we must first understand the wounds that made him so willing to join. Snape's journey from a bullied outcast to a master of the dark arts begins long before he ever wore a mask. He was born to a Muggle father who was often absent and a witch mother who was too worn down to protect him. The house in Spinner's End was cramped and cold, a place where magic was hidden like a shameful secret. But the moment he learned that he was a wizard, everything changed. At Hogwarts, he was sorted into Slytherin, where he found a new identity. Yet even there, he was an outsider. Too poor for the pure-blood crowd, too dark for the ordinary students, and too obsessed with forbidden knowledge to make easy friends. He wore his brilliance like a shield. But it was a shield that others used against him. Enter the Marauders. James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew. They were not just rivals, they were tormentors. And their cruelty was not the clumsy bullying of ordinary children. It was inventive, public, and relentless. They used their animagus forms, their knowledge of the castle's secrets, and their popularity to humiliate Snape at every opportunity. The worst moment, the one that would burn deepest into his soul, came in their 5th year. Sirius, with a casual malice, told Snape how to get past the Whomping Willow during a full moon, knowing full well that Remus Lupin was a werewolf inside the Shrieking Shack. Snape almost died. He was saved at the last second by James Potter, but the rescue was not an act of kindness. It was a performance, a way to make Snape look weak and indebted. And Dumbledore, in his infinite wisdom, swore everyone to secrecy, forcing Snape to carry the memory of that night alone. That moment of radicalization, fueled by bitterness toward the Marauders, was not an instant decision to join Voldemort, but it planted a seed that would grow into a forest of resentment. He had seen that the world was unfair, that the good were not always kind, and that power, real power, was the only protection he could ever trust. So Snape turned inward to his books. His natural aptitude for potions was already legendary among his professors. Horace Slughorn called him a prodigy, and whispered about the dark modifications he would make, the standard brews. But Snape's true genius lay in the mind. He taught himself occlumency before he had ever heard the word. a discipline of closing one's thoughts, of building walls so strong that even a legilimens could not breach them. It was born of necessity. He had to hide his dark experiments from teachers, from rivals, from everyone, but he perfected it. The specific skills Snape brought to the Death Eaters, including potions and occlumency, were not his only talents. He was also a brilliant duelist and a master of non-verbal magic. But these two were the ones that made him invaluable. The Dark Lord valued secrets above all else, and Snape could keep secrets better than anyone. He could brew potions that could poison, heal or control, could read minds and shield his own with equal ease. He was in essence a spy waiting for a cause, and so, upon leaving Hogwarts, he found that cause. The Death Eaters welcomed him with open arms. Here was a half-blood, but his blood status was overlooked because his hatred was pure. He rose quickly, not through aristocratic connections, but through competence. Voldemort recognized a kindred spirit, a loner who had clawed his way into power. Snape was given tasks of infiltration and secrecy. He gathered intelligence on the Order of the Phoenix, identified weaknesses in ministry defenses, and used his potions expertise to create poisons that left no trace. He was a shadow, and he reveled in it. But the moment that defined his entire life came on a cold winter night in 1979 or early 1980. The date is murky, but the event is seared into history. Snape was in the Hog's Head Inn, an inn he frequented to meet with contacts and to stay beyond the watchful eyes of the Order. That night, he overheard something he was not meant to hear. Sybil Trelawney, desperate for a job, was murmuring a prophecy to Albus Dumbledore in a private booth. The wall was thin, and Snape's curiosity was sharper than any spell. He heard the words, "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies." It was vague, but it was enough. He carried that prophecy straight to his master, Voldemort. The fateful night Snape overheard the prophecy and changed the course of history. He did not know that he was condemning his childhood friend, Lily Evans, to death. He did not know that the prophecy would lead Voldemort to the Potters, and that the boy born in July would be her son. He only knew that he had pleased his master, and that his place in the inner circle was secure. But nothing stays secure for long. The night the prophecy was overheard was the night the Death Eater's path began to twist toward its own destruction, and the boy who had clawed his way into the darkness would soon be forced to choose between the power he craved and the only love he had ever known. That choice would shatter him, and it would set the stage for the fall of 1981. A movement shattered not by a single battle, but by the impossible weight of a single broken heart. The last chapter closed on a young man standing at a crossroads, a dark mark burning into his forearm, his soul already fractured. Severus Snape had made his choice, or at least he thought he had. But while he was still learning the arts of occlumency and brewing poisons in the shadows, the world he had sworn allegiance to was about to shatter in a single, violent instant. The story of the Death Eaters is not just a story of a fanatical loyalty. It is also a story of how quickly that loyalty can evaporate when the fear of their master is replaced by the fear of their own survival. Halloween night, 1981. The air in Godric's Hollow was cold and still. A baby lay in a cot, his mother's body at the foot of the stairs, his father's wand discarded in the hall. The Dark Lord, Lord Voldemort, had entered that cottage with absolute confidence. He had walked through the wreckage of the Potter's home, his followers waiting in the shadows beyond the village, ready to celebrate the end of the prophecy. But the sound that echoed through the night was not a cry of triumph. It was a shattering of something far more terrible. A green flash, a scream, and then silence. The killing curse rebounded, and the most feared wizard in a century was reduced to less than a ghost. Across the length and breadth of Britain, in hidden manors and dingy pubs, in the secret chambers of the Ministry and the cold cells of Azkaban, every Death Eater felt it, not with their ears, not with their eyes. They felt it in the burning of their forearms. The dark mark, that skull with the snake unfurling from its mouth, the brand they had all accepted as a badge of invincibility, began to pulse. Then it began to fade. For those who were awake, it was a physical sensation like a rope suddenly gone slack. For those who were asleep, they woke with a jolt, clawing at their sleeves, staring in horror as the black ink of their loyalty turned to a dull, painful grey, and then to a pale, colourless scar. The panic was immediate and absolute. Think of a colony of ants. When the rock under which they have built their nest is suddenly flipped over, there was no order, there was no plan. The movement that had been built on the iron will of one man, on the terror of his presence, on the promise that he would never fall, had no backup, no contingency. Voldemort had never taught them how to survive without him, because he had never believed such a thing was possible. And so, in the hours after the attack at Godric's Hollow, the so-called Invincible army disintegrated into chaos. In the grand drawing rooms of the Malfoy estate, Lucius Malfoy stared at his left arm, his face a mask of calculated panic. He had always been careful. He had always played both sides. But now the Dark Lord was gone, and the Ministry would be coming for names. He did not waste a single second mourning his master. He began burning letters, hiding dark artifacts, and reinforcing his alibi. For Lucius, the cause was never more important than the Malfoy name, and the name needed distance from the disaster. In a shabby flat above a muggle shop, Peter Pettigrew felt the fading of his mark and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was already a coward. He had already betrayed his friends. But now, with Voldemort vanished, he realized he was nothing more than a rat caught in a trap. His terror of the Dark Lord's return was matched only by his terror of the justice that was about to descend. He did not wait to see who would be captured. He transformed, scurried into the shadows, and vanished from the wizarding world for over a decade. Bellatrix Lestrange, however, did not panic in the same way. Her reaction was something far more dangerous. She refused to believe it. In the Lestrange family manner, she held her marked arm, pressing her nails into the flesh, as if she could force the colour back. She screamed. She cursed. She insisted that the Dark Lord would return, that this was some kind of test. But her husband Rodolphus and his brother Rabastan, they were already looking to the door, already thinking of escape. And when the Ministry agents stormed their home days later, she was still raving, still loyal, still unreachable. That fanaticism would land her in Azkaban. But not before she and her companions had one last act of terror to perform. The collapse was not clean. It was a frenzy of self-preservation. Every man for himself became the only rule. Some Death Eaters, like Antonin Dolohov, fought back when the auras came, killing and cursing until they were overwhelmed. Others, like Augustus Rookwood, a spy within the Department of Mysteries, tried to disappear into the bureaucracy they had once infiltrated. But the Ministry, for once, was efficient. There would be trials. There would be sentences. And those who had not been captured immediately began to point fingers at one another. The most striking abandonment of the cause came from those who had never truly believed. They had joined for status, or protection, for the thrill of being on the winning side. But the winning side had just lost everything. And in the cold light of a world without Voldemort, the prospect of a lifetime in Azkaban, the Dementors, the cold, the madness, became a far more immediate terror than the anger of a master who might never return. So they lied. They claimed they had been under the Imperius curse. They said they had been blackmailed. They wept in courtrooms and begged for mercy. Some were believed. Many were not. The wizarding public, of course, celebrated. The reign of terror was over, or so they thought. The front page of the Daily Prophet screamed about the boy who lived, about the fall of Unauhu, about a new dawn. But in the cellars and the safe houses, in the hidden corners of Nocturne Alley, a quieter, darker reality was taking shape. The Death Eaters were not destroyed. They were scattered, wounded, and hiding. And some of them, the truly devoted, the ones like Bellatrix, waited. They nursed the ember of hope that their master was not truly gone. They watched for signs, and they prepared for a return that they believed was inevitable. But for now, the movement was shattered. The great army that had terrorized Britain for a decade had become a collection of fugitives, liars, and broken fanatics. And the Ministry's next task was to sort through the wreckage, to hold the trials, to decide who would rot in Azkaban and who would walk free. The betrayals were just beginning. The true traitors, the ones who had sold their comrades to save their own skins, were about to step into the light. And the story of how the Death Eaters fell apart from the inside is a story of desperation, cowardice, and the hunger for redemption at any cost. That story, the story of the trials and the traitors, is waiting just ahead. The dark marks on the arms of Voldemort's followers had faded to a dull grey, no longer burning with the Master's power. In the weeks after the failed attack at Godric's Hollow, the Ministry of Magic scrambled to assert control over a shattered wizarding world. The Death Eaters, once a shadowy terror network that had held Britain in a chokehold, now scattered like leaves before a gale. Some went underground, others fled the country, and a few in their panic turned on one another. It was out of this chaos that the Ministry's crackdown emerged. A sweeping, desperate attempt to bring order through the high-profile trials of the early 1980s. The Ministry itself was reeling from a decade of infiltration and fear. The newly appointed minister, Millicent Bagnold, faced a public that demanded justice. Rumours of corruption and Imperius-tainted officials had eroded trust, so the trials were staged as spectacle, meant to be seen as a full and final reckoning. The Wizengamot, the ancient council of witches and wizards who served as the Supreme Court, convened in a chamber that had not seen such crowds in generations. Journalists from the Daily Prophet filled the gallery, quills scratching furiously as each prisoner was brought before the bench. The accused arrived in chains, their faces half hidden in shadow, many still wearing the tattered remnants of their black robes. Some had been caught in the immediate aftermath. Others were dragged from hiding places in the following months. The trials were not simply legal proceedings, they were acts of catharsis. The Ministry needed to demonstrate that the terror was over, that the Death Eaters were beaten, and so the cross-examination began, each session dripping with venom and accusation. But cracks appeared quickly. Many of the accused claimed they had been under the Imperius curse, unable to resist Voldemort's commands. The Ministry had no reliable way to disprove this. Veritaserum was not always admissible, and the memories of witnesses were clouded by fear and trauma. It was into this atmosphere of uncertainty that Igor Karkaroff stepped forward. Karkaroff had been a Death Eater in the First War, a man of some status within the movement. He had fled immediately after Voldemort's fall, but the Ministry's net caught him in a safe house in Eastern Europe. Facing life in Azkaban, Karkaroff made a calculated choice. He would betray his former comrades in exchange for his freedom. It was a decision that would shape the course of the trials and the public's perception of justice. Karkaroff named names, dozens of them, and his testimony sent shockwaves through the wizarding community. He gave up Antonin Dolohov, the Caro siblings, Augustus Rookwood, and a host of other dark wizards who had previously escaped detection. Each name was a fresh wound, a revelation that the enemy had been hiding in plain sight. The Wizengamot, hungry for convictions, accepted Karkaroff's testimony without much scrutiny. He was granted a full pardon, and the Ministry paraded him as a model of reform. But the cost was steep. Karkaroff's betrayal saved his own skin, but it also poisoned the well for other defendants. Those he accused were rounded up and tried, many without the benefit of a fair defense. The trials became a witch hunt in the truest sense, a purge of the movement's inner circle that also swept up lesser followers who might have been coerced. Still, the public applauded. Each conviction was reported as a victory, a sign that the Ministry was finally in control. Yet for every Death Eater sent to Azkaban, there were others who slipped through the cracks. The most infamous escape came through the so-called Imperius defense. Lucius Malfoy, the wealthy and well-connected pure-blood aristocrat, stood before the Wizengamot with an expression of wounded innocence. He claimed that Voldemort had placed him under the Imperius curse from the very beginning, that his actions, raising funds, recruiting followers, providing safe houses, had all been performed against his will. It was a brazen lie, and many in the courtroom suspected as much, but Lucius had prepared his ground. He brought character witnesses, offered bribes to the right officials, and presented a fabricated memory that seemed genuine to all but the most skilled legilimens. The Ministry, eager to avoid a scandal involving one of its most prominent families, accepted his defense. He walked free, his reputation intact, his fortune untouched. Lucius was not alone. Other wealthy and influential families employed similar tactics, claiming coercion or ignorance. The Malfoys, the Knots, the Greengrasses, all used their status to evade justice. The Ministry's crackdown, so aggressive at first, began to lose momentum as political pressures mounted. The trials dragged on, and the public grew weary. By the end of 1982, most of the known Death Eaters had been imprisoned in Azkaban, including the Lestranges, Dolohov, and the Carrows. But the public had been sold a false sense of security. They believed that the last of Voldemort's followers were behind bars, that the war was truly over. They did not see the dark wizards who remained free, waiting in the shadows, nursing their grudges and their loyalty. The Ministry declared victory, and life returned to a fragile normalcy. The newspapers stopped printing articles about Death Eater trials. The dark marks that remained visible on the forearms of the prisoners in Azkaban burned no longer. But in the quiet homes of the surviving followers, there was no peace, only a long, patient stillness. They knew that the Master had not truly died, and so began a waiting game, a silent decade that stretched from 1982 to 1994, where the silence was not peace, but a prelude to a second storm. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The trials of the early 80s sent a clear message to those who had served Voldemort. Ministry officials lined up the accused, read out charges of torture, murder, and conspiracy, and sent the most fanatical to Azkaban, while others wriggled free by claiming the Imperius curse had controlled them. Igor Karkaroff had named names, trading secrets for his own freedom, and his betrayal left the surviving Death Eaters scattered and paranoid. But the silence that followed was not peace. It was a long, patient wait, a quiet preservation of the faith in the shadows of the old estates. While the Ministry celebrated its victory, and the wizarding world tried to forget the years of terror, the ideology of blood purity did not die. It went underground, sheltered behind the thick stone walls of manor houses that had stood for centuries. Two estates in particular became its sanctuaries: Malfoy Manor and the ancient Black family home at Grimmauld Place. They were worlds unto themselves, places where the values of pure blood supremacy could be whispered over fine wine, passed down in heirlooms, and tucked away in secret rooms. At Malfoy Manor, Lucius Malfoy weathered the storm with practiced grace. He had been a loyal Death Eater, but he had also been careful. He had not been caught in the act. His wealth and influence had bought him silence, and he had the perfect cover. Perspective on the Board of Governors at Hogwarts, a seat at the Ministry's most exclusive functions, and a name that still opened doors. But in private, in the dim light of his study, he kept the old symbols close. The dark mark on his arm had faded to a faint grey scar, but he knew it was only dormant. He believed, with a certainty that bordered on religious, that the Dark Lord was not gone forever. Meanwhile, the Black family estate at number 12, Grimmauld Place, stood as a monument to the old ways. The Blacks were a family of pure blood fanatics, proud of their lineage and ruthless in their rejection of anything less. They had disowned Sirius for his rebellion, and they raised their children on a diet of ancient magic and family pride. The house itself was a museum of pure blood ideology. Portraits of ancestors who sneered at half-bloods, a tapestry of the Black family tree that burned away the names of those who married muggles, and a collection of dark artifacts so dangerous that even the Ministry might have hesitated to confiscate them. It was in these spaces that the seeds of the next generation were planted. The children of the old Death Eaters grew up surrounded by stories of the good old days, when wizards like their fathers ruled the world. They learned that blood was destiny, that muggles were vermin, and that the Dark Lord had been a misunderstood visionary. They were groomed not with overt training in the dark arts, but with a slow, steady drip of prejudice and privilege. One name stands out above all others in this quiet grooming: Draco Malfoy. Born in 1980, he was the son of Lucius and Narcissa, the heir to the Malfoy fortune, and the living embodiment of the Sacred 28. The Sacred 28 was a list, published in the 1930s, of the only true pure-blood families left in Britain. It was a badge of honour for families like the Malfoys, the Blacks, the Greengrasses, and the Knots. They held themselves apart, intermarried, and cherished their bloodlines as if they were made of pure gold. Draco was raised to believe he belonged to an elite, a class of wizards who were born to rule. His childhood was not like that of ordinary children. He never played Quidditch, in a field with Muggle-born friends. He never visited a Muggle city. His world was the manor, its sprawling grounds, and the exclusive circles of pure-blood society. His father taught him that the Ministry was weak, that Dumbledore was a fool, and that Muggles were beneath contempt. Narcissa, though less overtly cruel, reinforced the importance of family and status. Draco grew up with a silver spoon, but also with the weight of expectation. He was to be a leader, a defender of the old ways, and if the Dark Lord ever returned, a loyal servant. But the Malfoys were not the only family preserving the old artifacts. In the deepest vaults of Malfoy Manor, or perhaps in the study of Lucius's private collection, there sat a diary. It was an ordinary-looking journal, black leather, blank pages. But it was not ordinary. It was one of Tom Riddle's Horcruxes, a fragment of his soul, carefully preserved and hidden away. Lucius had been entrusted with it before the Dark Lord's fall. Or perhaps he had taken it himself. He kept it safe, not because he understood its true nature, but because he knew it was precious to his master. He believed that if the diary survived, the Dark Lord might one day return. And yet, for more than a decade, nothing happened. The diary remained inert, waiting for a victim to open it. The dark mark on Lucius' arm stayed grey. The world moved on. A new generation entered Hogwarts, unaware of the shadows gathering, but the signs were there, if you knew where to look. In the summer of 1994, the Wizarding world gathered for the Quidditch World Cup. It was a massive event, held in a magical stadium that housed hundreds of thousands. Families from all over the world came to watch Ireland face Bulgaria. For a few days, it seemed as if the old fears had been forgotten. The Ministry was confident, the crowds were festive, and the matches were thrilling. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. On the night after the final match, as the celebration wound down, a group of masked figures appeared out of the darkness. They wore white masks, black robes, and they moved with a terrifying purpose. They were not the Death Eaters of old, not yet, but they were their successors. Fanatics, thrill-seekers, and young men eager to prove their loyalty. They began to terrorize the Muggle camp, levitating a family, setting fires, and casting the dark mark into the sky. It rose, green and glowing, a skull with a serpent for a tongue, hanging over the forest like a curse revived. The Ministry's response was chaotic. Auras rushed in, but the perpetrators vanished into the night, leaving only fear and questions. The dark mark had not been seen in 13 years. Its return sent a shockwave through the Wizarding world. For those who had served the Dark Lord, it was a signal, a whisper, that the time of waiting might soon be over. For those who had hoped for peace, it was a terrible reminder that the evil they thought dead was only sleeping. In the aftermath, whispers spread. Some said Voldemort was alive, hiding, gathering strength. Others insisted it was only a prank, a copycat act. But those who knew the truth, who had felt the dark mark burn on their arms, understood that a line had been crossed. The long wait was coming to an end. And yet, even as the mark blazed in the sky over the Quidditch World Cup, a far more sinister plan was already unfolding. A plan that involved an old friend, a betrayal, and a graveyard in the village of Little Hangleton. That story, the story of the Dark Lord's true resurrection, is one that does not begin with a riot, but with a quiet, patient servant and a cup of blood. And it will end, as all such stories do, in fire and bone. The sacred 28 families kept the embers of blood purity alive through those quiet years. But embers are not fire. For a fire to truly catch again, it needs a spark. And that spark would be struck not in a grand hall or a political chamber, but in a forgotten graveyard on the edge of a Muggle village called Little Hangleton. This is where the long wait ended, where the Phantom Lord, who had haunted the shadows for over a decade, finally grasped for a body of bone, flesh, and blood. The night of the ritual is a study in contrasts. It is a muggy summer evening in 1995, and the air hangs thick with the scent of damp earth and old stones. The graveyard is choked with weeds, the headstones tilting like broken teeth. At its centre stands a crumbling Riddle family mausoleum, and beside it, a rough-hewn stone wall. The scene is almost banal, a forgotten corner of the rural English countryside. But the magic about to unfold here would shake the Wizarding world to its core. The key players are assembled not by choice, but by compulsion. Peter Pettigrew, the rat-like servant who has spent 12 years in hiding, scurries around the graveyard, setting a cauldron over a fire. He carries the bundled, barely conscious body of Harry Potter, a boy who was kidnapped from the Triwizard Tournament, dragged here as the final ingredient in a dark recipe. And then there is the creature in the cauldron's shadow, a small, hairless, snake-like thing, barely alive, cradled in the arms of the man who served as Voldemort's most loyal infiltrator, Barty Crouch Jr. That creature is Voldemort, reduced to a trapped spirit, dependent on others for survival. The ritual begins with a whispered incantation. Pettigrew takes a silvery bone from a pouch, a bone of the father, taken from the grave of Tom Riddle Sr., the muggle who abandoned his wife and son. He drops it into the bubbling cauldron. Then he cuts off his own right hand and adds it to the potion. Flesh of the servant, willingly given. Finally, he draws blood from Harry Potter's arm, blood of the enemy forcibly taken, and lets it drip into the mixture. The cauldron roils, turning a blinding white, and then a shape rises from it. Tall, skeletally thin, with red eyes and a face that is more serpent than man. Lord Voldemort has returned. He steps out of the cauldron, naked and trembling, with a terrible, concentrated power. The first word he speaks is not a curse, but a command, a demand for his robes. Then he looks at his servant, Pettigrew, who is whimpering on the ground, clutching the stump of his wrist. Voldemort does not offer healing. He orders Pettigrew to be bound and thrown aside. There is no gratitude for the servant, who spent years in hiding and sacrificed a limb. There is only contempt. The Dark Lord raises his wand, a wand that was just a borrowed tool, but now feels right in his hand. He presses the tip of it against the dark mark on the forearm of Pettigrew, and instantly the mark begins to burn and sear across all the marked followers left in the world, from their hiding places, from the safety of their manor houses, from the shadows of Diagon Alley, from the cells of Azkaban. The Death Eaters feel the call. They must come. They must apparate to his side. One by one, they arrive in the graveyard. The first to materialize is Lucius Malfoy, his face pale, his eyes darting. Then comes Severus Snape, expressionless as always, though his heart may be racing. Jugson, Dolohov, Not Ave, a dozen or so dusty, nervous figures. They kneel before their master, hissing the hem of his robes, murmuring their loyalty. But Voldemort is not satisfied. He circles them like a predator sizing up prey. He notes the missing faces. Those who did not come. Those who claimed they had been under the Imperius curse, or who simply faded into obscurity. They are the Fairweather followers, and Voldemort will remember their names. He begins a slow, methodical assessment. He points to each kneeling figure and speaks of their cowardice, their failure to seek him out during his exile. You, Karkaroff, he says. Though Karkaroff is not present, he fled. Voldemort tells the assembled that some will be rewarded, others punished. He conjures a painful reminder for those who tried to deny their past. The Cruatus Curse. He tortures Avery, who stands trembling to demonstrate that the old order is restored. No one is safe. No loyalty is assumed. Then comes the declaration. Voldemort points his wand at the sky and casts the dark mark, a skull of emerald fire that hovers over the graveyard. I have waited 14 years, he says. Now the Second Wizarding War begins. The words are not a threat. They are a statement of fact. The Death Eaters rise, their fear mingling with a heady dose of ambition. They have their master back, and with him, the promise of power. They are soldiers again, but the night is not over. Voldemort turns to Harry Potter, the boy who survived, and he offers him a chance to fight, a duel, a spectacle. He wants to show his followers that he is truly invincible. The battle that follows is brief but brutal. An exchange of spells that ends with Harry being bound, his wand snatched away, and Voldemort delivering the Death Eaters' first official act of the new war. A public showdown with their greatest enemy. And yet, even as Voldemort exults, there is a thread of unforeseen consequence. Harry escapes, not through his own strength, but through the twin cores of their wands, a connection Voldemort never anticipated. The boy returns to Hogwarts, clutching the body of Cedric Diggory, and soon the wizarding world will know the truth. The Dark Lord is back. The war is real. But for the Death Eaters, this night marks the turning point. The ritual of bone, flesh, and blood is complete. The Dark Lord is whole again, and the story now pivots to the man who made it all possible. The Infiltrator, the spy who walked among the champions and teachers of Hogwarts without detection. That man, Barty Crouch Jr., will have his own dark chapter, one that reveals just how deep the corruption went and how close Voldemort came to winning. Long before anyone realized the war had started, the ritual was complete. Bone, flesh, and blood had given Voldemort back his body, and the dark mark burned with renewed fire over every loyal follower's arm. In the graveyard at Little Hangleton, the gathered Death Eaters knelt in terror and devotion, but among them one figure stood apart. Not in the circle, but beside the Dark Lord himself, his presence already proven beyond doubt. That figure was Barty Crouch Jr., and his story is one of the most extraordinary and terrifying acts of deception in wizarding history. To understand how Barty Crouch Jr. became Voldemort's most effective infiltrator, you have to go back before the resurrection, before the Triwizard Tournament, before he ever set foot in Hogwarts as Alastor Moody. He was the son of a ministry man, Barty Crouch Sr., a rising star in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The father was cold, ambitious, and utterly devoted to public order. The son was brilliant, hungry for approval, and drawn to the darker corners of magic that his father's world condemned. It was a recipe for rebellion. Young Barty found what his father could never give him in the charismatic embrace of Lord Voldemort. Voldemort offered purpose, power, and a father figure who demanded absolute loyalty but also promised belonging. For a boy starved of genuine affection, that was intoxicating. Barty threw himself into the Death Eater cause with a fervour that matched even Bellatrix Lestrange. He was captured after torturing Frank and Alice Longbottom into madness with the Cruciatus Curse. Acts he performed not out of vague ideology, but with the joy of a son proving himself to a monster. His father presided over his trial. Barty Crouch Sr., the very face of justice, watched his own son be sentenced to life in Azkaban. But the father's ambition did not extend to sacrificing his family's reputation entirely. With the help of his dying wife, he smuggled Barty Jr. out of Azkaban, replacing him with his mother's corpse under the effects of Polyjuice Potion. The son was hidden under an invisibility cloak, kept prisoner in his own home, controlled by his father's Imperius curse. For years he lived as a ghost, a secret shame, locked in the attic of the Crouch house. That changed when Voldemort began to stir again. The Dark Lord, now a disembodied spirit, learned of Barty's survival through Peter Pettigrew. Voldemort and Pettigrew freed Barty from his father's control, and the son found his true father once more. In return, Voldemort demanded a service of unparalleled risk: infiltrate Hogwarts, impersonate Alastor Moody, and engineer the Triwizard Tournament so that Harry Potter would be delivered into the Dark Lord's hands. This was not a simple disguise. Barty Crouch Jr. had to become Alastor Moody, the most paranoid Auror in magical history. He had to fool Dumbledore, the most perceptive wizard alive. He had to live under the same roof as his target for an entire year. The incredible year-long deception of Alastor Mad-Eye Moody required every ounce of Barty's intelligence, patience, and cruelty. First, he captured the real Moody, imprisoning him in a magical trunk that could hold a human being. He then used Polyjuice Potion to transform into Moody's appearance, maintaining the disguise by drinking a fresh dose every hour. He studied Moody's mannerisms, his gruff voice, his magical eye, his prosthetic leg. He even went so far as to mimic Moody's distrust of everyone, turning it into a character tic that made his paranoia believable. He knew that to deceive Dumbledore, he had to be perfect, and he was. For 10 months, Barty Crouch Jr. moved through Hogwarts as the defense against the dark arts teacher. He taught the students about unforgivable curses with a chilling authenticity that should have raised alarms. Everyone assumed Mad-Eye was simply that intense. He demonstrated the Imperius curse on Neville Longbottom, a boy whose parents had been tortured into insanity by the very curses Barty had once used. The cruelty was personal, hidden in plain sight. How Barty Crouch Jr. manipulated the Triwizard Tournament from within Hogwarts was a masterpiece of subtle engineering. He knew Harry's name would be entered into the Goblet of Fire by his own hand, using a powerful Confundus charm to trick the ancient artifact. He then ensured Harry would survive each task by feeding him hints in disguise. First as Moody telling Cedric Diggory about the dragons, then directly whispering to Harry about Gillyweed before the second task, and finally arranging for the Triwizard Cup to be a portkey that would transport Harry to the graveyard. The strategic brilliance of removing Harry Potter from Dumbledore's protection cannot be overstated. Hogwarts was the safest place in the wizarding world, watched over by the greatest wizard alive. But the Triwizard Tournament, by its very nature, required Harry to be alone in dangerous places. Barty used the tournament's own structure to create a window of vulnerability. He made Dumbledore believe that Harry's participation was part of the tournament's ancient magic, not a dark plot. He turned the protective rituals of the school into the very mechanism of betrayal, and all of this was driven by a son's desperate need for a father figure. Voldemort had become the father Barty Crouch Sr. never was. The Dark Lord offered praise for a job well done, something the real father had withheld his entire life. Barty's loyalty was not just ideological. It was emotional, possessive, and utterly consuming. He would do anything to keep that approval, even kill his own father when he stumbled upon the plan. When the moment came at the graveyard, Voldemort acknowledged Barty as his most faithful servant, the one who had done more than any other to restore him, and Barty, kneeling in the dirt, felt a satisfaction he had never known. He had proven himself worthy of the monster's love. But his story does not end there. After Harry escaped the graveyard and returned to Hogwarts, the truth began to unravel. Dumbledore, stunned by the revelation, confronted the fake Moody. The Polyjuice potion wore off, and Barty Crouch Jr. stood revealed, laughing in his cell before Dumbledore's pensieve, a confession that sealed his fate. He was kissed by a Dementor, his soul sucked out, leaving nothing but an empty shell. Yet his legacy endures as a chilling example of how the most dangerous enemy is not the one who attacks with a wand, but the one who smiles at you from behind a trusted face. The infiltration of Hogwarts was not just a tactical triumph for the Death Eaters. It was a psychological blow that shattered the illusion of safety, and as the Dark Lord's power grew, the Ministry itself began to crumble from within. The methods of deception and control that worked so brilliantly on one school were about to be applied to an entire government. That story, how the Death Eaters turned the very institutions built to protect society into tools of oppression, is the next chapter in this dark history. Barty Crouch Jr.'s deception had been a masterstroke of infiltration, but when the truth shattered the Great Hall at Hogwarts, the Ministry reacted with the fury of a cornered beast. They imprisoned the impostor, celebrated the return of the real Alastor Moody, and for a brief, deluded moment, believed they had cleansed the rot. But they had only amputated a single limb. The infection had already spread deeper than anyone suspected. And while Cornelius Fudge stood before the Wizengamot, insisting that Lord Voldemort could not possibly have returned, the Dark Lord's most patient servants were already inside the very heart of magical government. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement had always been the spine of the Ministry. It was the body that investigated crimes, enforced statutes, and maintained the fragile order of the wizarding world. But a spine can be weakened slowly, vertebra by vertebra, until the whole structure collapses under its own weight. The Death Eaters understood this intimately. They did not need to storm the atrium with wands blazing. They needed only to place their people in key positions, to whisper pressure on the right officials, to let the Imperius curse do its quiet work. So began the slow poisoning of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Campaigns so subtle that even the department's own employees did not recognize the sickness spreading through their corridors. At first, it was merely a change in tone. An Auror here, a clerical wizard there, began to show uncharacteristic favor toward pure-blood families. Reports of attacks on Muggle-borns were filed with less urgency. Investigations into the disappearances of known half-bloods were quietly shelved. When members of the Order of the Phoenix brought evidence of Death Eater activity, the new middle managers smiled politely and promised to look into it, then did nothing. The department still functioned, still printed forms, and held meetings and issued warrants. But the heart had been hollowed out. It was a bureaucracy running on habit, not justice. The architect of this corruption was not a Death Eater with a dark mark on his arm. It was a man named Pius Thickness, a senior official in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, who had never once raised a wand in Voldemort's service. But he had been made a puppet, and his strings were pulled by one of the most dangerous wizards in the inner circle. Using the Imperius curse on Pius Thickness was not a random act of violence. It was a surgical strike. Thickness was not the Minister of Magic. Not yet, but he held enormous influence over the daily operations of law enforcement. By controlling his mind, the Death Eaters gained the ability to direct the entire executive branch from behind the scenes. Every order Thickness gave was a whisper from Voldemort. Every signature he wrote was a stroke of the Dark Lord's will. The curse itself was a violation so complete that it left the victim's personality intact enough to be useful. Thickness still spoke with his own voice, still laughed at the same jokes, still greeted colleagues by name. He appeared exactly as he always had, except that now his decisions were not his own. He approved transfers of loyal ministry employees to dead-end posts. He authorized the promotion of wizards, sympathetic to the pure blood cause. He signed off on budget cuts to departments that investigated crimes against Muggleborns, and nobody noticed, because the bureaucracy was designed to trust its leaders. The system had no mechanism to check for puppets. The Death Eaters turned the law into a weapon against the innocent with breathtaking efficiency. The very statutes that had once protected the wizarding community were twisted into instruments of oppression. The most devastating example was the creation of the Muggleborn Registration Commission, a body that existed for no purpose other than to identify, humiliate, and ultimately destroy anyone with non-magical parents. The commission was framed as a matter of public safety, a bureaucratic response to the supposed threat of Muggleborns who had stolen wands from true witches and wizards. But it was a tool of genocide, nothing more. Under the guise of a census, the ministry demanded that every Muggleborn wizard report for an interview. During that interview, they were required to prove that they had a magical relative somewhere in their family tree. If they could not, and most could not, their wand was snapped, their name was entered into a registry, and they were stripped of every legal right. They lost their jobs, their homes, their freedom. Many were sent to Azkaban on fabricated charges of conspiring with the Dark Lord's enemies. The Muggleborn Registration Commission was not a court. It was a death sentence processed through triplicate forms. The Death Eaters who staffed the commission wore the same clean robes as any other ministry worker. They used polite language and stamped documents with official seals, but their work was indistinguishable from the raids and kidnappings that Bellatrix, Lestrange, had once carried out in the open. The only difference was that now it was legal. The law itself had become a weapon, and the innocent had no defense, because the very idea of innocence had been redefined. A Muggle-born was no longer a citizen. They were a criminal by birth, and the law existed to punish them. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, once a symbol of order, had become a machine for persecution. Its clerks were complicit, its auras were compromised, and its head was a puppet dancing on an invisible thread. The slow poisoning was complete. The Ministry of Magic, which had spent years refusing to believe that Voldemort had returned, was now his most powerful asset. The Dark Lord did not need to storm the atrium. He already owned it, and the bureaucracy would do his bidding without ever raising a wand. But there was one place within that ministry where the poison had not yet taken hold. A place where secrets were kept that Voldemort desperately needed. A place where a small group of fighters would soon converge, unaware that the battle they were about to fight would change the course of the war. That place was the Department of Mysteries. And what happened there would become the first public crack in the Death Eaters' carefully constructed illusion of control. By the summer of 1996, the slow poisoning of the Ministry of Magic had reached a critical stage. Pious Thickness, now under the Imperius curse, was a puppet whose strings were pulled from within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The machinery of the state was being turned, gear by gear, toward the service of the Dark Lord. But Voldemort, as patient as he was ruthless, understood that political control alone would not grant him the one thing he craved above all others: certainty. And certainty in his mind resided in a single object, a glowing glass sphere gathering dust on a shelf in the deepest, most forbidden chamber of the Ministry of Magic, the prophecy concerning Harry Potter and the Dark Lord himself. For months, the Death Eaters had been circling this objective with the stealth of predators. The problem was access. The Hall of Prophecy, buried deep within the Department of Mysteries, was not a place you could simply apparate into. Nor could you force your way past its enchantments. without triggering alarms that would bring the entire ministry down upon you. The only way to retrieve a prophecy was to have the person named in it physically lift it from the shelf. Voldemort, still a wraith in many ways, could not walk into the ministry himself, and so he needed bait. He needed Harry Potter. This was the genesis of the heist that would become the Battle of the Department of Mysteries. It was not a plan born of desperation, but of a cold, calculated belief in the power of suggestion. Voldemort understood the boy's mind far better than Harry ever wanted to admit. He knew that Harry, burdened by his connection to the Dark Lord, was vulnerable to manipulation through that very bond. And so, in the late spring of 1996, Voldemort planted a false vision into Harry's mind, a vision of Sirius Black, Harry's beloved godfather, being tortured in the bowels of the ministry. The image was so vivid, so visceral, that Harry could not question it. He had to act. What Harry did not know, what he could not have known, was that he was walking into a trap designed by the most tactically minded of Voldemort's followers. The plan was simple in theory. Lure Harry to the Department of Mysteries, force him to retrieve the prophecy, and then seize it. The execution, however, fell to Lucius Malfoy, and this, as history would record, was the first of many tactical errors that would seal his fate. Lucius Malfoy was a creature of influence, not of battlefield command. He was a manipulator, a whisperer in corridors, a man who wielded galleons and social standing like weapons, but he was not a soldier. He had spent the years of Voldemort's first fall maintaining his position through plausible deniability and careful lies. He was not accustomed to leading armed assaults, yet Voldemort, ever suspicious of the proud Malfoy patriarch, gave him command of the mission. It was a test, and Lucius, desperate to prove his loyalty after years of hiding behind his fortune, accepted. The chosen team reflected Lucius's own limitations. He brought together a group of Death Eaters who were formidable in their cruelty, but lacking in coordination. Antonin Dolohov, a veteran of the First War, was a killer of terrifying skill, but he was reckless. Bellatrix Lestrange was fanatical to the point of madness, a loose cannon who followed her own instincts rather than orders. There were others as well. The hulking Jugson, the nervous Mulciber, and the skilled but arrogant Augustus Rookwood. They were not a cohesive unit. They were a collection of individual terrors, each expecting to be the star of the show. When Harry, Hermione, Ron, Neville, Ginny, and Luna Lovegood arrived at the ministry that fateful night, they were children walking into a den of wolves. The Department of Mysteries itself was a labyrinth designed to confuse and disorient. The Hall of Prophecy stretched endlessly in every direction, row after row of shelves groaning under the weight of thousands of dusty prophecies. The air was cold and still, thick with the silence of secrets that had never been spoken. And there on row 97, Harry found his name, the prophecy with his own fate inscribed upon it. But as his fingers closed around the glass sphere, the trap snapped shut. The Death Eaters emerged from the shadows, and the high-stakes heist to retrieve the prophecy from the Hall of Prophecy became a desperate, bloody struggle for survival. Lucius Malfoy stepped forward, his voice dripping with polished arrogance, demanding the prophecy. He was calm. He was in control. He believed the outcome was inevitable. And then the children refused. The next few minutes revealed the fundamental flaw in Lucius's tactical thinking. He had prepared for an extraction, not for a fight against resistance that was willing to die rather than surrender. The Death Eaters had numbers and experience, but they had underestimated the raw, desperate courage of their opponents. Harry Potter, clutching the prophecy, led his friends through a series of rooms that defied logic. Rooms where time flowed backward, rooms filled with planets that spun in miniature orbits, rooms where thoughts became solid. It was chaos, and chaos favored the desperate. Lucius made his first fatal error when he split his forces. Instead of keeping his team together, he sent them fanning out through the department, confident that they could corner the children. But the department was not a battlefield, he understood. In the Room of Time, Neville Longbottom, of all people, managed to knock Bellatrix off her feet with a well-aimed blow. In the Brain Room, Ron's quick thinking sent a cascade of swirling thoughts, crashing into the attackers. The Death Eaters were used to terrorizing civilians, not fighting a coordinated retreat by determined young wizards. Their discipline fractured, but the children were not alone. The Order of the Phoenix, had been watching when Harry failed to reply to his friend's attempts to contact him. A force of the most battle-hardened wizards and witches in Britain mobilized. Sirius Black himself, the very man Harry had been tricked into believing was in danger, was among them. The arrival of the Order of the Phoenix and the first open conflict in years turned the heist into a full-scale battle. Alastor Moody, Nymphadora Tonks, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Remus Lupin, and Sirius himself crashed into the department like a storm of vengeance. The fight that followed was brutal, chaotic, and deeply personal. The Death Eaters, now facing organized resistance, began to fall back. Dolohov struck down Hermione with a curse that nearly killed her. Tonks was hit in the chest by a spell from Bellatrix. The corridor became a blur of green and red light, the shouts of curses, the crash of shattered stone. And in the center of it all, Lucius Malfoy was losing control. His second fatal error came when he realized that the prophecy could only be retrieved by Harry. He could not simply take it. He had to keep Harry alive until the object was safely in his hands. And that constraint turned him into a passive observer of his own defeat. The climax of the battle came in the Death Chamber, a vast amphitheater dominated by a raised stone archway draped in a tattered black veil. The veil whispered with the voices of the dead. It was a portal to the other side, and it was there that Bellatrix Lestrange, driven by her own fanatical recklessness, ignored Lucius's orders and launched a curse directly at Harry. Sirius, moving faster than thought, stepped into its path. The jet of red light struck him square in the chest, and he fell backward through the veil. He was gone before his body touched the ground. The death of Sirius Black was a psychological blow to the resistance that echoed far beyond that dark chamber. For Harry, it was the loss of the only parent figure he had left. A man who had been wrongfully imprisoned for 12 years, who had fought to clear his name, who had loved him unconditionally. For the Order of the Phoenix, it was a reminder that even their best could fall, that Voldemort's followers were willing to kill without hesitation. And for the Death Eaters themselves, the death of Sirius was a turning point. It was the moment when the mission collapsed entirely. Lucius Malfoy, standing helpless as Harry chased Bellatrix through the Ministry, knew that the plan had failed. The prophecy, once retrieved by Harry, was now shattered on the stone floor of the Death Chamber, its contents lost forever. The mission that was supposed to restore his standing with the Dark Lord had instead cost Voldemort his most desired prize, and the price of that failure would be measured not in galleons, but in pain. When Voldemort himself arrived at the Ministry, forced to intervene because his followers could not finish the job, he found only disaster. The Aurors were coming, Dumbledore was already there, and Lucius Malfoy, once the most influential Death Eater in wizarding Britain, stood revealed as an incompetent commander. In the chaos of the retreat, Lucius was captured. The Ministry finally had a high-profile Death Eater in custody, and they were not going to let him go. The Battle of the Department of Mysteries had ended. The first open conflict between the Death Eaters and the Order in years had been a Pyrrhic victory at best for the light. Sirius was dead. The Ministry was shaken, but the Dark Lord had been publicly exposed. No more could Cornelius Fudge deny the return of Voldemort. The war was now out in the open. As the prisoners were led away to Azkaban, a new shadow was already falling over the wizarding world. Voldemort's rage at Lucius's failure demanded a sacrifice, and he had chosen a young wounded boy to pay the price. The next stage of the war would not be fought in the halls of the Ministry, but in the halls of Hogwarts itself, where a desperate mission would be forced upon a son trying to save his family from the consequences of his father's ambition. The Battle of the Department of Mysteries had been a disaster for the Death Eaters, but no one felt the weight of that failure more than Lucius Malfoy. He had led the assault, orchestrated the ambush, and then watched as everything unraveled. The prophecy was shattered, the Order escaped, and worst of all, Lord Voldemort was forced to reveal himself to the Ministry, exposing the truth that so many had tried so hard to deny. For Lucius, the consequences were immediate and brutal. He was dragged to Azkaban, stripped of his status, his wealth, his influence. But Voldemort was not finished with him. The Dark Lord had a peculiar talent for making punishment last far longer than any prison sentence, and so the debt fell to the son. Draco Malfoy was just 16 years old when Voldemort summoned him to a meeting that would reshape his entire future. The boy arrived at his own home, Malfoy Manor, but it was no longer a place of comfort. It was a throne room for a monster. Voldemort stood before him, tall and pale, with those red eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone. He spoke of Lucius's failures with a cold, clinical detachment, as though reading a list of crimes carved into stone. Then he offered Draco a chance to restore the family honor, a chance to prove himself worthy of the Dark Lord's trust. He would be given a mission that no one else had been able to complete. He would kill Albus Dumbledore. This was not a promotion. It was a trap. Voldemort had no intention of letting Draco succeed. The task was designed to be impossible, a noose disguised as an opportunity. If Draco failed, he would die. If he succeeded, he would be destroyed in other ways. Either way, Malfoy's name would be crushed, and the Dark Lord would have his revenge on the father who had disappointed him. But to the outside world, and to Draco himself, it looked like a chance at greatness. The Malfoy pride would not let him refuse. He accepted the mission, and in that moment, he became a Death Eater in name, if not in conviction. The psychological toll began almost immediately. Draco was still a student at Hogwarts, forced to walk the hallways, with a secret that burned inside him. He had to pretend to be normal, to attend classes, to laugh with his friends, all while knowing that he was expected to murder the most powerful wizard alive. The pressure was unbearable. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. His schoolwork suffered. His temper flared at the slightest provocation. He lashed out at Harry Potter and Ron Weasley, not because he hated them, but because their presence reminded him of the world he had lost. The world of schoolyard rivalries and Quidditch matches and ordinary teenage concerns. That world was gone. In its place was a nightmare of constant dread. But Draco was not idle. He had been given a task, and he intended to carry it out using his intellect and his family's resources. The plan he devised was a masterclass in magical engineering and sabotage, centered on a pair of vanishing cabinets. One cabinet sat in the room of requirement at Hogwarts. The other was hidden in Borgin and Burke's, the dark artifact shop in Nocturne Alley. These were not ordinary storage units. They were connected by a form of magical space, allowing anyone who entered one to emerge from the other. It was a sophisticated piece of enchantment, and the cabinets had been damaged years earlier when Peeves, the poltergeist, had smashed one during a prank. Draco's mission was to repair that connection, to create a secret passage into Hogwarts so that Death Eaters could bypass the castle's defenses. He worked in secret, spending countless hours in the room of requirement, coaxing the broken cabinet back to life. He studied advanced magical theory, experimented with incantations, and risked exposure every time he stepped inside that hidden room. The work was tedious and dangerous. One wrong spell could have sent him into a void from which there was no return. But Draco was determined. He had to succeed. He had to prove that he was more than his father's mistakes. And yet, as the months passed, a different truth began to surface. He was not a killer. The internal conflict was becoming impossible to ignore. Draco had been raised on stories of pureblood supremacy, of the glory of the Dark Lord, of the necessity of power and fear. But when it came time to act, he found that he could not cross that line. He maimed, he poisoned, he endangered others. He nearly killed Ron Weasley with a cursed necklace and almost murdered Katie Bell with a poisoned mead. But he never intended to kill directly. These were accidents, desperate gambits, that he hoped would open the door for an easier assassination. When the moment finally came, on the astronomy tower, with Dumbledore standing before him, disarmed and helpless, Draco could not speak the killing curse. His hand trembled, his voice cracked. He lowered his wand. That moment of weakness saved nothing and cost everything. Dumbledore was killed anyway, by Severus Snape carrying out his own secret pact. But Draco's failure was complete. He had shown himself to be not a loyal soldier, but a frightened boy. And in the eyes of Lord Voldemort, there was no greater sin. The Dark Lord did not kill Draco, but he did not forget. The young Malfoy was allowed to live, forced to watch as his home became a headquarters for terror, forced to endure the screams of tortured captives, forced to feel the weight of his own cowardice every single day. He was a Death Eater in name, but his heart had never belonged to the cause. In the end, Draco Malfoy was not a villain. He was a pawn, a tool used to punish a father's failures, a boy who learned too late that the path of darkness was not for him. His story is a tragic chapter in the history of Voldemort's army, a reminder that even the most carefully laid plans can be shattered by the simple truth that some people are not born to kill. The Vanishing Cabinet was repaired, but it was not used to bring a single assassin into Hogwarts. It was used to bring an army, and that army was about to strike the greatest blow yet, targeting the one wizard who could still stand against the Dark Lord. The stage was set for a tragedy that would change everything. The fall of the greatest wizard was imminent, and the Death Eaters were already moving into position. They just needed the right moment, the right betrayal, and the right hand to deliver the blow. When Draco Malfoy accepted his mission in the fall of 1996, he believed he was walking toward greatness. Instead, he walked into a trap designed by Lord Voldemort himself, a punishment disguised as an honor, a test designed to break him. For months, Draco struggled under the weight of an impossible task: kill Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard alive. He failed again and again, and yet Voldemort never intended for Draco to succeed. The Dark Lord had already prepared another hand to strike, a hand that had been waiting for years. That hand belonged to Severus Snape, but before Snape could act, the Death Eaters needed to enter Hogwarts, and they found their way through a door that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. The Room of Requirement. This room, which appears only when someone truly needs it, had served generations of students as a hiding place, a training ground, and a sanctuary. But in the spring of 1997, it became something else. A secret passage for the enemy. Draco had been using the room all year to repair a vanishing cabinet, a cursed object that linked to its twin in Borgin and Berks in Nocturne Alley. The Death Eaters could step through that cabinet and emerge inside Hogwarts, bypassing every ward, every enchantment, every protection Dumbledore had placed around the castle. And so, on the night of June the 30th, the infiltration began. The Order of the Phoenix had been warned that Voldemort might try to attack that night. Dumbledore had left the school with Harry Potter to retrieve a Horcrux from a treacherous cave. While they were gone, the castle grew quiet. Students were confined to their common rooms. The staff were on alert, but no one expected an invasion from within. When Dumbledore and Harry returned, exhausted and weak from the Horcrux hunt, the dark mark appeared above the astronomy tower. The signal was given. Inside the Room of Requirement, the Death Eaters spilled out of the Vanishing Cabinet one by one. Amicus Carrow, Alecto Carrow, Antonin Dolohov, Thorfinn Roll, Fenrir Greyback, and others. They moved through the corridors, silently, spreading through the castle, waiting for the signal to strike. Harry, under his invisibility cloak, was sent by Dumbledore to fetch Snape, but by the time Harry returned, the trap had already closed. Dumbledore faced his killers on the astronomy tower, high above the grounds. With Hogwarts sprawling below him in the moonlight, the confrontation was brief. Draco Malfoy, trembling, disarmed Dumbledore, stripped him of his wand, but Draco could not finish the deed. He lowered his wand, and then Snape arrived. With a single word, Avada Kedavra, Severus Snape sent the green bolt of death into Dumbledore's chest. The greatest wizard of the age fell from the tower, his body crashing to the ground below. In that moment, the wizarding world lost its anchor. Dumbledore had been the only force keeping Voldemort at bay. The one wizard the Dark Lord truly feared. His death signaled the end of safety, the collapse of hope. The Death Eaters had done what they had failed to do for years. They had broken the Order's heart. With Dumbledore gone, the Ministry of Magic fell next. The Death Eaters, now at the peak of their power, moved from shadows to open control. They infiltrated every branch of government, imposed blood purity laws, and began hunting Muggle-borns. Hogwarts itself became a fortress of fear under the Carrows. The war was no longer a secret, it was a conquest. But even as Voldemort celebrated his greatest victory, a seed of rebellion had already been planted. Harry Potter, the boy who had witnessed Dumbledore's fall, now carried a mission of his own. The Horcruxes remained, and the story was far from over. What happened next would transform Britain into a totalitarian state, where even the Ministry's own employees became prisoners of their own desks. The Death Eaters' ascension reached its zenith in the months that followed, and the world learned just how dark a regime could grow when hope was stolen. That chapter, the fall of the Ministry into total control, would test the very soul of the wizarding world. The death of Albus Dumbledore left the wizarding world without its greatest protector. In the days that followed, as grief and confusion spread like a thick fog across Britain, the Death Eaters moved with a precision that had been years in the making. They did not strike with fire and curses in the open. Instead, they slipped into the Ministry of Magic like shadows, one office at a time, one official after another, until the entire machinery of government was theirs. The silent coup that took place while the wizarding world slept was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, methodical suffocation, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, it was far too late to resist. Pius Thicknesse, the Minister for Magic, had been under the Imperius curse for months, placed there by the Death Eater, who had infiltrated the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. But that was only the beginning. With Thicknesse as their puppet, the Death Eaters appointed their own people to every key position. The Aura Office was purged of anyone who might oppose them. The Department of Magical Transportation was taken over, ensuring that flow networks and portkeys could be monitored and controlled. The Daily Prophet was brought to heel, its editor replaced with a compliant mouthpiece. And then the monument appeared. In the main atrium of the Ministry, where once a golden fountain had celebrated the unity of wizards, goblins, centaurs and house elves, there now stood a grotesque statue carved from dark stone. A towering figure of a witch and wizard sat upon a throne of writhing, crushed muggles, their faces twisted in agony. At the base of the statue, carved in golden letters, were the words, "Magic is might." This was the rebranding of wizarding history, a public declaration that the old ideals of cooperation and equality were dead. The Ministry was no longer a protector of all magical beings. It was a fortress of dark ideology, a temple to pure blood supremacy. With the Ministry fully under their control, the Death Eaters turned their attention to the one threat that still haunted Voldemort, Harry Potter. The hunt for undesirable number one became the highest priority of the new regime. Posters appeared in every public space, bearing Harry's face and a reward of 10,000 galleons for information leading to his capture. But the Death Eaters knew that ordinary wizards might hesitate to betray the boy who lived, so they created a new force to enforce compliance, the Snatchers. These were ruthless bounty hunters, often criminals or former Death Eaters themselves, who roamed the countryside in search of Muggleborns, blood traitors, and anyone who might know Harry's whereabouts. The reward system for Snatchers was simple. They were paid per head, and they were allowed to keep whatever valuables they found. It was a license for terror, and they used it without mercy. The transformation of the Ministry into a fortress of dark ideology was complete. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures now had a new subdivision dedicated to the registration of Muggleborns. Anyone who could not prove they had a pure blood parent was stripped of their wand, their livelihood, and often their freedom. These Muggle-born registration hearings were a sham, designed to fill the cells of Azkaban with innocent people. The Ministry's own employees were required to prove their blood status, and those who refused or failed were dismissed, often arrested on the spot. The very halls that had once housed the heart of wizarding law now echoed with the footsteps of Death Eaters, who walked openly, their masks no longer needed, because everyone knew who was in charge. And yet, even in this darkness, there were cracks. A resistance began to form, small and secret but determined. The underground radio program Potterwatch broadcast coded messages of hope. The Order of the Phoenix, though battered and scattered, continued to protect Harry from the shadows. And Harry himself, along with Ron and Hermione, moved through the countryside like ghosts, hunting the Horcruxes that would ultimately destroy Voldemort. But the Ministry was lost. It would take a war to win it back, and that war had not yet begun. As the autumn of 1997 turned to winter, the Death Eaters consolidated their power. They turned their eyes next to the one place that had always resisted them. School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The new headmaster, Severus Snape, walked the corridors under the watchful eyes of the Carrow siblings, Alecto and Amicus, who had been appointed to enforce the new order. And it is their dark reign within the castle walls that we will explore next, as the story of Voldemort's secret army continues into Chapter 20. when the ministry fell, it did not simply crumble into rubble. It was hollowed out from within, reshaped into a machine that served a single will. And with that machine now fully operational, Voldemort turned his gaze to the last great institution that still held any independent power in wizarding Britain, Hogwarts. The school had always been a fortress of defiance, a place where the old headmaster had stood as the ultimate obstacle. But Dumbledore was gone, and the new headmaster, Severus Snape, had been appointed under terms that left no room for resistance. Yet even Snape's appointment was not enough. The Death Eaters needed to ensure that the next generation would be shaped in their image, that the children of the wizarding world would grow up knowing nothing but fear, obedience, and the absolute supremacy of pure blood. And for that task, Voldemort sent two of his most faithful and most brutal servants, Amicus and Alecto Carrow. The Carrow siblings had long been part of Voldemort's inner circle, but their specialty was not battlefield command or political manipulation. They were enforcers, torturers, and above all, educators in the darkest sense. Amicus, the brother, was a squat, twitchy man with a high-pitched laugh that seemed completely at odds with the cruelty he exuded. Alecto, his sister, was stocky and grim, her eyes holding a permanent gleam of malice. They arrived at Hogwarts at the start of the school year, not as simple teachers, but as agents of a new order. Snape was headmaster, but everyone knew who really held the power. The Carrows had been given authority to rewrite the curriculum, to impose discipline through pain, and to turn the ancient castle into a training ground for the next wave of Death Eaters. The dark transformation of education under Amicus and Alecto Carrow was immediate and absolute. The first sign of change came during the opening feast, where once the Sorting Hat had sung of unity and courage, it now sang a warning of submission. The students, many of whom had known only the relatively peaceful years of Harry Potter's era, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The Carrows did not wait. The very next day, Amicus took over the defense against the dark arts position, but he did not teach defense. He taught the dark arts themselves, and he taught them with a practical, hands-on approach that would have made even the most hardened Auror shudder. Alecto took Muggle studies, a subject that had once been about understanding non-magical people, and turned it into a propaganda course on Muggle inferiority and the necessity of wizarding domination. But the most horrifying change came in the form of a new mandatory lesson. The Cruciatus Curse, one of the 3 unforgivable curses, was no longer just a theoretical concept studied in textbooks and avoided in practice. It became a required part of the curriculum. Amicus would stand at the front of the classroom, his wand held loosely, and he would call for volunteers. Those who refused were marked as troublemakers. Those who complied were forced to cast the curse on students who had been tied to chairs, their faces white with terror. The scream of a victim under the Cruciatus is a sound that cannot be forgotten. It is a high, piercing wail that seems to come from somewhere deeper than the throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. The Carrows made sure that every student heard it, and that many learned to produce it. Turning the Cruciatus Curse into a mandatory part of the curriculum was not just about teaching a spell. It was about breaking the students' spirits, about desensitizing them to suffering, and about creating a generation that would see torture as normal, even necessary. The Carrows understood that the best way to radicalize the young was to make them complicit. If you force a student to cast an unforgivable curse on a classmate, that student is no longer an innocent. They are stained, and they know it. The guilt can be twisted into loyalty. The horror can be buried under a mask of indifference. Amicus would laugh his high, nervous laugh as the curses flew, and he would praise those who showed no hesitation. The students who resisted, who refused to raise their wands, were punished severely. Detention with the Carrows was not a matter of writing lines. It was a matter of being on the receiving end of the very curses they had refused to cast. The resistance of the D.A. and the underground war within the castle walls began almost immediately. Neville Longbottom, who had once been the timid boy who could barely remember the password to the common room, became the heart of that resistance. He had seen his parents destroyed by the Cruciatus Curse, and he would not let the Carrows inflict that same fate on other students. He reactivated the Dumbledore's Army, the secret student organization that had fought against Umbridge years before. But now the stakes were far higher. The DA operated in whispers, meeting in the room of requirement, which still answered to those who needed a place to hide. They smuggled out students who were being targeted, sabotaged Carrow's lessons, and spread coded messages of hope. They learned to fight dirty, to use the castle's secrets, and to rely on each other. The Carrows knew the DA existed, but they could never fully stamp it out. Every time they caught a member, another rose up. The war within the walls was a war of attrition, and the students were determined not to lose. The Carrows attempted to radicalize the next generation of students through a combination of fear, propaganda, and forced conformity. Slytherin House, as expected, became the base of their support. Many Slytherins eagerly embraced the new order, seeing it as a chance for power and advancement. But not all. Some Slytherins quietly resisted, remembering that their own head of house, Severus Snape, had once been a Death Eater, but had died fighting for the light. The Carrows tried to turn house loyalty into a tool of division, pitting Gryffindors against Slytherins, rewarding informants and punishing any sign of dissent. They instituted a curfew and patrols, and the corridors of Hogwarts, once filled with laughter and whispered secrets, became silent and tense. The portraits whispered warnings, the ghosts refused to cooperate, and Peeves the poltergeist became a surprisingly effective agent of chaos, dropping heavy vases on unsuspecting Death Eater teachers. But the most insidious part of the Carrows' plan was the psychological warfare. They targeted Muggle-born students openly, forcing them into hiding, sending them to the Ministry for questioning, or simply making them disappear. The message was clear. Blood purity was not just a belief, it was a law, and anyone who was not pure had no place in the wizarding world. The school became a microcosm of the terror that gripped the rest of Britain. The students learned to watch their words, to trust no one, and to survive. The DA became a lifeline, a reminder that there were still people willing to fight. Neville, Ginny Weasley, Luna Lovegood, and others took enormous risks, sneaking through secret passages, creating decoys, and keeping the flame of rebellion alive in a castle that had become a prison. Throughout all of this, Snape remained an enigma. As headmaster, he was forced to implement the Carrows' policies, to sign decrees, and to protect them from outside interference. But he also subtly protected the students when he could, refusing to allow the Carrows to use the Cruciatus curse on children in his presence, and ensuring that punishments were not fatal. The students did not know whether to trust him or hate him. Some believed he was a traitor to Dumbledore's cause. Others suspected he was playing a dangerous double game. The truth, as it would later be revealed, was that Snape was still working for the Order, but he could not show his hand. He allowed the DA to exist as long as they did not openly challenge the regime, and he used his position to gather intelligence. The Carrows resented him, but they feared Voldemort's favour for Snape, so they kept their complaints to themselves. The underground war within the castle walls reached its peak in the months leading up to the final battle. The DA had grown in numbers, and they had begun to strike back more openly. They sabotaged Carrow's lessons by hiding the practice dummies. They let loose creatures from the Forbidden Forest during detentions, and they began to train in, preparing for the day when they would have to fight for more than just their freedom. The Carrows responded with greater cruelty, but every act of oppression only hardened the resolve of the students. The school, which had once been a place of learning and laughter, had become a battlefield, and the Carrows were losing the war for the hearts and minds of the next generation. Their brutality did not create loyal Death Eaters. It created survivors who would one day rise up and tear down everything the Carrows stood for. As the months dragged on, the Carrows realized that their mission was failing. They had tried to radicalize the students, but they had only succeeded in creating a resistance movement that was more determined than ever. The dark transformation of education under Amicus and Alecto Carrow had turned Hogwarts into a place of horror, but it had also revealed the strength of those who refused to be broken. The last embers of that rebellion would burn brightest in the final confrontation, when the Battle of Hogwarts began. And when that battle came, the Carrows would be among the first to fall, their cruelty finally meeting its match. But before that battle, the Death Eaters needed to ensure that no one could escape or call for help. They needed a network of hunters, of mercenaries who could track down Muggle-borns and other fugitives, who could enforce the new order beyond the castle walls. That network was already taking shape, hidden in the shadows of the wizarding world, waiting for its moment to strike. That story belongs to the Snatchers, and to the outer ring of Voldemort's army, who lurked just beyond the edge of the map. But as the Carrows tightened their grip on Hogwarts, turning the ancient castle into a prison of fear, another force was already reshaping the world beyond its walls. The dark transformation of education under Amicus and Alecto was only the visible horror. The true nightmare was unfolding across the British countryside, where law and order had not just crumbled. They had been replaced by something far more insidious. This is where the story of the Snatchers begins. The Ministry fell quietly, but the vacuum it left behind was filled not by a single hand, but by 1,000 grasping ones. Voldemort's inner circle, the marked Death Eaters, could not be everywhere at once. They were the generals, the strategists, the ones who whispered commands in dark manners and commandeered ministry offices. But the war required soldiers on the ground, men and women willing to do the dirty work, to hunt down Muggle-borns, to patrol the villages, to sniff out resistance. And so the Snatchers were born. These were not the proud, masked followers who had stood in the graveyard at Little Hangleton. The Snatchers were the outer ring, the expendable scum, the mercenaries and bounty hunters, who had no dark mark burned into their forearms. They were not bound by loyalty to Voldemort's ideology. They were bound by greed, by the promise of gold, by the thrill of power over the helpless. In a world where the Ministry had become a puppet, where the Aurors were either dead or in hiding, where every village had become a potential hunting ground, the Snatchers carved out their own lawless dominion. You could see them on the roads, in the forests, the edges of sleepy hamlets. They travelled in packs, rough-looking witches and wizards, with shabby robes and wands, always at the ready. They set up checkpoints, demanded identification, and if you couldn't prove your blood status, you were dragged away. The Snatchers didn't care about justice. They cared about the bounty on every Muggle-born head. The Ministry, now a puppet of the Death Eaters, had put a price on fugitives, on blood traitors, on anyone who defied the new order, and the Snatchers were the hunters. But there was a hierarchy, and it was brutal. At the top sat the true Death Eaters, the ones who had knelt before Voldemort and received the mark. They looked down on the Snatchers with contempt, using them as tools, as fodder, as convenient scapegoats. Lucius Malfoy, even in his diminished state, would never have shared a table with a Snatcher. Bellatrix Lestrange would have sneered at their lack of lineage. Yet these outer ring mercenaries were essential. They allowed Voldemort's regime to extend its reach, without diluting the inner circle's purity. The Snatchers did the hunting, the Death Eaters did the killing, and when a Snatcher became too ambitious or too inconvenient, they were disposed of without a second thought. One figure rose above all others in this dark ecosystem, embodying the terror of the outer ring like no other. Fenrir Greyback was not a true Death Eater in the traditional sense. He was not a pure-blood supremacist by ideology. At least not in the way that the Malfoys or the Lestranges were. Greyback was something far more primal. He was a werewolf, and he used his curse as a weapon, as a tool of biological warfare. Voldemort had long courted the werewolf community, promising them a place in the New World Order. But it was Greyback who turned that promise into a reign of fear. Greyback didn't just kill, he infected. He attacked children, families, the vulnerable, because turning a child into a werewolf was a form of terror that rippled far beyond one death. It was a slow, brutal sentence. The werewolf's bite meant exile, a life of shame, of hiding, of periodic madness under the full moon. Greyback understood this. He relished it. He would walk into a village, not to capture a Muggle-born, but to leave a mark on the community that would last generations. The Ministry's old laws had already marginalised werewolves, but Greyback weaponized that marginalisation. He turned the curse into a recruitment tool, promising werewolves revenge against the society that had cast them out, and Voldemort gave him free rein. The Dark Lord saw werewolves not as equals, but as shock troops. They were to be unleashed on the countryside, to spread chaos, to break the will of the opposition. Greyback was allowed to operate with near total autonomy, gathering packs of feral followers, terrorizing villages, and serving as a living, breathing symbol of what happened to those who resisted. The Snatchers feared him. The Death Eaters tolerated him. The common witches and wizards prayed. They would never hear his guttural laugh in the night. The breakdown of law and order was not accidental. It was engineered. By removing the Ministry's protective hand, by allowing Snatchers to roam unchecked, by unleashing werewolf packs on the countryside, Voldemort created an environment where no one could feel safe. The wizarding world had once believed in the rule of law, in the Ministry's power to protect. That belief was shattered. Every knock on the door could be a Snatcher. Every shadow could hide Greyback's pack. The countryside became a patchwork of frightened villages, isolated families, and desperate fugitives. The Snatchers were the eyes and ears of this new regime. They reported to the Death Eaters, but they also kept their own secrets, their own profits. They would capture anyone they could sell, ransoming lives for gold. The hierarchy was clear. The true Death Eaters gave orders, the Snatchers carried them out, and the werewolves provided the raw terror that kept everyone in line. But underneath that hierarchy, there was constant tension. Snatchers resented being treated as expendable. Greyback despised taking orders from purebloods who would never consider him an equal, and the Death Eaters watched it all, knowing that this fragile alliance could collapse at any moment, but also knowing that for now, it served Voldemort's purpose perfectly. The countryside became a hunting ground. The Order of the Phoenix and the remaining resistance were forced into hiding, moving from safe house to safe house, never staying long, always listening for the sound of approaching footsteps. The Snatchers were everywhere, in the shadows of Diagon Alley, on the edges of Hogsmeade, in the forgotten corners of the English countryside. They were not all powerful, but they were many, and they were motivated by a simple truth. In a world without law, the only currency is fear, and at the very center of this web, of terror and greed, there was a place where the Snatchers brought their prizes, where the true Death Eaters gathered, where Greyback himself was sometimes summoned, a place that became the dark heart of the new regime, a manor that held secrets far worse than any Snatcher's shack. That place would soon become the stage for one of the most desperate moments in the war. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me. Coming next, we'll challenge everything you thought you knew. The Snatchers and the Outer Ring were the visible muscle of Voldemort's regime, the mercenaries and bounty hunters who dragged innocent Muggle-borns and suspected blood traitors out of their homes and into waiting hands. But the Snatchers were merely the net, the true heart of the Dark Lord's operation. The place where fear was not just inflicted but institutionalized was Malfoy Manor. Of all the grand pure-blood estates in Britain, none had fallen so far from grace as the home of Lucius Malfoy. Once a symbol of wealth, influence, and carefully cultivated respectability, Malfoy Manor had become the dark headquarters of Voldemort's army, and with that transformation came something far more devastating than any curse: the displacement of the Malfoy family in their own home. Lucius Malfoy had spent years currying favor with the Ministry, weaving political webs, and presenting an image of polished superiority. He had believed that his fortune and his family name would grant him immunity from the worst of the Dark Lord's whims. But Voldemort did not care for status or comfort. He cared for results. And after Lucius's failure at the Department of Mysteries, after the loss of the prophecy, after the humiliation of seeing his prized wand snapped and his position stripped away, the Malfoys were no longer hosts by choice. They were hosts by command. The manor itself became a space where the family's authority evaporated. Lucius walked through his own hallways with his head lowered, his once haughty demeanor replaced by a permanent tremor of dread. Narcissa Malfoy, who had always moved through the world with an icy grace, now found herself stepping around Death Eaters who tracked mud across her Persian carpets, who helped themselves to the contents of her wine cellar, who occupied rooms that had once been reserved for the most exclusive pure-blood gatherings. And Draco Malfoy, the heir to the Malfoy legacy, was reduced to a pale ghost, barely speaking, barely eating, his mission to kill Dumbledore having scarred him in ways that no amount of occlumency could hide. The family's displacement was not a physical eviction, but something far more insidious. They were no longer masters of their own home. They were prisoners in it, forced to witness their private spaces, transformed into a command post for terror. The drawing room, where Lucius had once hosted elegant dinner parties for ministry officials, now served as a meeting chamber for Voldemort and his inner circle. The grand dining table, polished mahogany that had held silver candelabras and fine china, was now covered in maps, lists of Muggle-born targets and dark artifacts. The smell of death clung to the curtains, and the very air seemed heavier, laden with the unspoken threat of violence. But the most harrowing transformation was what lay beneath the manor's elegant facade. The basement dungeons, once used to store wine and the occasional family heirloom, had become a revolving door of political prisoners and enemies. It was there that the true horror of the Death Eater's operation played out, hidden from the eyes of the wizarding world above. The dungeons were cold, damp, and lit only by the dim glow of torches that seemed to feed on the misery they illuminated. Prisoners were brought in by the Snatchers, bound and hooded, their identities unknown until the hoods were pulled off. Some were Muggle-borns who had evaded capture for months, their faces gaunt from hunger and fear. Others were members of the Order of the Phoenix, captured in skirmishes or betrayed by informants. And still others were ordinary witches and wizards who had been accused of sympathizing with the wrong side, their only crime a misplaced word or a name on a list. The dungeon served as an interrogation chamber, a holding cell, and often a final destination. The Death Eaters who frequented Malfoy Manor took a particular pleasure in the screams that echoed up through the floorboards. Bellatrix Lestrange, in particular, seemed to come alive in that cold space, a maniacal laughter rising above the cries of her victims. She would descend the stone steps with a spring in her step, her wand already drawn, eager to prove her loyalty to the Dark Lord through acts of unspeakable cruelty. The murder of Charity Burbage, the Muggle Studies professor at Hogwarts, was a stark example of what the dungeons represented. She had been snatched from her home, dragged to Malfoy Manor, and made to kneel before Voldemort in the grand dining hall. There, in front of the assembled Death Eaters, she had been subjected to a public spectacle of condemnation. Voldemort had used her to send a message, not just to the wizarding world, but to anyone who still harboured sympathy for Muggles and Muggle-borns. He had spoken of her teachings, her belief that Muggles were not so different from wizards. And then he had taken her life with a single terrible curse. Her body was left as a warning, a piece of theatre designed to instill terror in the hearts of all who dared to question pure blood supremacy. The message was clear. There was no safe place for those who disagreed. Not even Hogwarts, not even the Ministry, not even the silence of one's own home could protect you from the reach of the Dark Lord. And the Death Eaters who witnessed Charity's murder understood something else, something perhaps more chilling than the act itself. The atmosphere of fear that even the highest-ranking Death Eaters felt was a constant, invisible presence in Malfoy Manor. They appeared loyal, they appeared powerful, but behind their masks, behind their bravado, they knew that Voldemort's favour was fickle. He had killed his own followers before, for far less than bringing a failure into his presence. Lucius Malfoy had been humiliated, but he was still alive. Others had not been so fortunate. The fear that gripped the manor was not just for the prisoners in the dungeons. It was for everyone who walked those halls, from the lowliest snatcher to the most trusted lieutenant. Bellatrix herself, though she seemed immune to doubt, was driven by a desperate need to prove her worth. She had spent years in Azkaban, and she knew that Voldemort's love was conditional. One misstep, one moment of perceived weakness, and the Dark Lord could turn on her with the same merciless efficiency he showed to his enemies. The others, men like Antonin Dolohov and Augustus Rookwood, walked a similar tightrope. They laughed and toasted to the Dark Lord's victory, but their eyes were always scanning, always calculating, always searching for the next threat that might come from within. Malfoy Manor had become a place where no one was safe. Not the Malfoys, not the Death Eaters, not the prisoners. It was a microcosm of the regime itself, a system built on fear and sustained by fear. With Voldemort at its centre, a spider who required constant offerings of loyalty and suffering to maintain his power. The family's displacement was a symbol of the emptiness at the heart of the Death Eater ideology. They had wanted power. They had wanted to be on the winning side. But in the end, they had sacrificed everything. Their home, their dignity, their very souls, for a master who would discard them the moment they ceased to be useful. And as the days wore on, as the war ground its way toward its inevitable conclusion, the manors, dark corridors, held secrets that not even the most loyal Death Eaters knew. One of those secrets was hidden in a locket that held the fragment of a soul, and a betrayal that would echo far beyond the walls of Malfoy Manor. The Malfoy Manor had become a hollow shell, its gilded surfaces now only a backdrop for terror. And in that terror, there was a strange kind of silence among the Death Eaters themselves. They did not speak of doubts. They did not question the orders that came from the Dark Lord's lips. But somewhere, in the shadows of the war, there was one who had been a true believer, a child of the Black family, a boy who carried the weight of his bloodline like a curse. He had been a Death Eater. He had worn the mask. He had knelt before Voldemort, and for a time he had believed. But then he discovered a secret, and that secret changed him forever. This is the story of Regulus Arcturus Black, the younger brother of Sirius, the disowned heir of the Black family, the boy who was supposed to be the perfect pure-blood son, the obedient follower, the pride of his parents. But he became something else. He became the defector who stole from the Dark Lord. He became the one who chose death over obedience. He became the sacrifice in the sea cave, and in doing so, he delivered a wound that Voldemort never saw coming. To understand Regulus, you have to understand the world he was born into. The Black family was one of the oldest and most prestigious pure bloodlines in Britain. Their motto, toujours pur, spoke of a pride that bordered on obsession. They were proud of their heritage, proud of their dark arts, proud of their connections, but they were also a family of extremists. They did not merely tolerate the ideology of blood purity, they embodied it. The tapestry in the drawing room at 12 Grimmauld Place was a genealogical monument to their fanaticism. Every marriage, every birth, every exile was recorded, and if a family member married a Muggle or a Muggle-born, their name was literally blasted off the fabric, a burn mark left behind as a permanent scar. Regulus grew up in this environment. He was the second son, the backup heir. Sirius was the rebellious one, the one who defied his parents, who was sorted into Gryffindor, who eventually ran away to live with the Potters. Regulus was the opposite. He was quiet, obedient, and eager to please. He absorbed his mother's teachings. He listened to her rants about blood traitors and Muggle lovers. He learned to fear the Dark Lord, but also to admire him. When Voldemort first rose to power, the Black family were among his earliest supporters. They saw him as the one who would restore the old ways. They saw him as a leader worthy of their allegiance. And so, when Regulus was old enough, he joined. He took the Dark Mark. He became a Death Eater. It was what was expected of him. It was what his parents had wanted. And for a time, he served with the same quiet dedication he had shown as a child. He seemed to believe every word, every command. But there was a difference between Regulus and his cousins, or his peers. He wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. He didn't revel in torture the way Bellatrix did. He was loyal, but he was not a sadist. And that distinction would prove critical. The turning point came during a mission. Regulus was present, likely as a junior member, when Voldemort performed something he had never shown to many of his followers. He took Regulus to a cave on the coast. This was the same sea cave that Harry and Dumbledore would later visit. The cave was dark, desolate, carved by the waves and hidden from the world. Inside there was a lake, an island at its center, and on that island, a stone basin filled with a potion. Voldemort needed a house elf to drink the potion. He had brought Creature, the Black family elf, along. Regulus didn't know why at first. He watched as Voldemort forced Creature to drink the emerald liquid. He watched the elf writhe in agony, his screams echoing off the cave walls. And then Voldemort placed a locket inside the basin, adding to the potion, and left Creature to die. That was the moment when the mask slipped. Regulus saw the Dark Lord's callousness, his willingness to discard anyone, even the loyal servant of a loyal family. He saw that Voldemort did not care about followers, only about his own immortality, and he saw something else. He saw the locket. It was a Horcrux. Though Regulus might not have known the word at the time, he knew it was a piece of Voldemort's soul. He knew the Dark Lord had hidden something of immense value, something he treasured above all else, and he knew that to destroy it would be to wound the monster. Creature survived. He apparated away at the last moment, returning to the Black House, his body broken and his mind scarred. Regulus found him there. He heard the story. He saw the evidence of Voldemort's cruelty in the elf's suffering, and in that moment Regulus made a decision. He decided to betray the Dark Lord, not with a wand raised in open rebellion, but with the plan, a single daring act of defiance. He had to be careful. The Dark Lord could read minds, or at least sense disloyalty. Regulus had to act as if nothing had changed. He continued to attend meetings. He continued to wear the mark. But inside, he was already gone. He began to gather information. He learned about the locket, about the potion, about the dangers of the cave. He knew that to retrieve the Horcrux, someone would have to drink the poison, and he knew Voldemort would never do it himself. So Regulus decided that he would be the one. He would drink the potion. He would take the locket, and he would die. He prepared a fake locket, a replica, and placed a note inside. The note read, "To the Dark Lord, I know I will be dead long before you read this, but I want you to know that it was I who discovered your secret. I have stolen the real Horcrux and intend to destroy it as soon as I can. I face death in the hope that when you meet your match, you will be mortal once more." It was a powerful statement, but also a recognition of his own mortality. Regulus knew he would not survive the cave. He accepted that. He took Creature with him. He ordered the elf to bring him to the cave, to force him to drink the potion, and then to leave with the locket. Creature tried to resist, but Regulus insisted. He said his master's orders were clear, and so they went. The cave was as dark and cold as Regulus remembered. The lake was still, but the Inferi lurked beneath its surface. Regulus did not hesitate. He stepped into the small boat, crossed to the island, and faced the basin. He reached out and took the locket from its resting place. Then he commanded Creature to give him the potion to drink. Creature did not want to. He tried to drink it himself, but Regulus forced him. The potion was horrific. It burned. It made him see visions. It made him beg, scream, cry. He begged for water. He begged for death. He was in agony, but he did not stop. He drank every last drop. When the basin was empty, Regulus took the real locket and switched it with the fake. He handed the fake locket to Creature and told him to put it back in the basin. Then he stumbled toward the shore. The Inferi rose from the lake, their hands reaching, dragging him under. Creature watched his master disappear beneath the water. He could not save him. He could only follow his last command. He took the real locket and apparated away. Regulus Black died in that cave. He died alone, in darkness, at the hands of the creatures his master had created. But he died free. He died having struck a blow against the immortal tyrant. He died as the defector who proved that even the most loyal follower can turn. The irony is that Voldemort never truly understood this. He believed in fear and power. He believed that his followers would never dare to betray him, because the consequences were too terrible. But Regulus was not afraid of consequences. He was afraid of what Voldemort had become. He was afraid of the man who could use a house elf as a disposable tool. He was afraid of the monster who thought himself beyond death. Internal dissent was the one threat Voldemort never truly anticipated. He spent so much effort guarding against external enemies, against Dumbledore, against the Order, against Harry Potter. He created Horcruxes to protect himself from death, but he never imagined that someone like Regulus Black would see through the illusion. He never considered that a quiet boy, a faithful servant, could be the one to unravel his plans. The legacy of the Black family was one of extremes. Fanaticism defined them for generations. But in the end, the quiet rebellion of Regulus was what mattered. He did not burn his name off the tapestry. He did not shout his defiance from the rooftops. He simply did what he believed was right, and he paid the ultimate price. The Black family tapestry still bears his name, but it is a name that now stands for something more than blood purity. It stands for sacrifice. The locket he stole passed through Creature's hands to Mundungus Fletcher, then to Dolores Umbridge, and eventually to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They carried it through the forests of Britain, through the tent in the cold nights, until Ron finally pierced it with the sword of Gryffindor. When the locket was destroyed, so was another piece of Voldemort's soul, and it was Regulus who had started that chain of destruction. He died in 1979, a year before Voldemort's first fall. He died so that others might live to see the end of the war. He died with no one knowing, except Kreacher, who kept his secret for years, nursing the locket and the memory of his master's final act of bravery. In the aftermath of the Battle of Hogwarts, when the dead were counted and the war was finally over, there was no statue for Regulus Black, no public recognition, but his name is spoken by those who know the truth. And in the quiet of Grimmauld Place, Kreacher would sometimes gaze at the tapestry, at the small golden star beside Regulus's name, and he would remember. There is another kind of war, the war fought in the shadows by those who never seek glory. Regulus Black was a defector, a traitor to the Dark Lord, and a hero in the truest sense. He proved that even the most obedient follower can find the strength to turn, and that a single act of defiance can echo through the years. And now, as the war machine of the Death Eaters continued to grind forward, Voldemort began to think about allies that were not wizards. He considered the creatures of the wild, the giants of the mountains, and the silent watchers of Azkaban. He would forge alliances not built on loyalty, but on terror and hunger. The logistics of war required more than just spells and wands. They required forces that could crush, that could terrify, that could sweep aside all resistance. And so, the Dark Lord turned his gaze toward the giants and the Dementors, ready to bring them into his service. That is where the next chapter of this war would unfold, in the raw, brutal and terrifying world of the creatures that served no master but fear itself. The story of Regulus Black, the young man who dared to steal a locket, ended in a cold sea cave, with Inferi dragging him beneath the water and the Dark Lord's Horcrux safely replaced with a fake. But for every act of defiance, Voldemort's response was not merely punishment, it was escalation. And as the Order of the Phoenix celebrated small victories, the Dark Lord was busy forging alliances that no human wizard could match. To wage a war of terror, you need more than followers who are afraid. You need creatures who feel no fear, creatures whose very existence is a weapon. Voldemort understood this better than anyone. He looked beyond the wizarding world's borders, beyond the carefully policed boundaries of magical society, and into the wild, untamed spaces where the old magic still breathed. He sent emissaries to the mountains, to the frozen wastes, to the depths of the sea, and from those places, he summoned the monsters. The first and most obvious were the giants. For centuries, giants had been pushed further and further from human settlements. The Ministry of Magic, in its endless quest for order, had driven them into remote mountain ranges. The last of them hiding in the mountains of northern Europe, beyond the reach of even the most determined hit wizards. They were a dying breed, their numbers dwindling, their culture crumbling. They lived in clans, ruled by the largest and most brutal among them, and they nursed a deep, simmering hatred for wizards. Voldemort saw that hatred as a resource. He sent his most persuasive followers into the mountains, not to negotiate but to offer. The giants were given a simple choice. Join Voldemort, and they would have land of their own. They would have freedom to roam, to hunt, to kill. They would be permitted to slaughter muggles without consequence. Something the Ministry had forbidden for centuries, and above all, they would be allowed to fight. The promise of violence was the key. Giants are not subtle thinkers. They respect strength, and they respect the chance to prove their own. Voldemort's ambassadors painted a picture, a world where wizards and giants would no longer be enemies, where the giants would be allies, granted territory, and unleashed upon the enemies of the Dark Lord. The recruitment effort was brutal, bloody, and effective. Within months, entire clans had sworn allegiance. There were some who resisted, of course. The giant Gurg, the leader of one clan, was killed by his own successor after refusing to negotiate. But in the end, Voldemort secured the loyalty of dozens of giants, each one capable of crushing a building with a single blow. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were living siege weapons. When Death Eaters attacked a village, giants were sometimes sent ahead to tear down walls, to stamp out resistance, to create chaos. Their presence alone was enough to break morale. And when the Ministry heard of giants marching alongside masked wizards, they knew the war had entered a new, darker phase. But giants were only part of the equation. To truly control the wizarding world, to rule through fear, Voldemort needed something far more insidious. He needed the Dementors. The Dementors of Azkaban had long been the Ministry's most terrible secret. They were not allies. They were prison guards, bound by ancient agreements to serve the wizard who held the most power. They fed on human happiness and hope, draining their victims of all joy until they were left as empty shells. For years, the Ministry had maintained a fragile truce with them, but that truce was always temporary. The Dementors were not loyal to any government. They were loyal to despair, and Voldemort was the master of despair. He orchestrated the mass breakout from Azkaban, not as a prison break, but as a recruitment drive. In January of 1996, while the wizarding world was still reeling from the revelation of his return, the Dementors abandoned their posts. They rose from the island fortress like a black tide, sweeping through the cells, freeing every Death Eater they could find. Bellatrix Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, the Lestranges, and dozens more emerged from the stone walls, their loyalty rekindled by the Dark Lord's presence. And then, without a word, the Dementors bowed. They swore allegiance to Voldemort. This was not a partnership of equals. The Dementors were not soldiers. They were a force of nature. But Voldemort understood that controlling them meant controlling the Ministry's greatest weapon. Without the Dementors, Azkaban became a hollow fortress. The Ministry could no longer hold its most dangerous prisoners. And worse, the Dementors now roamed freely across Britain, attacking at will. They sucked the warmth from villages, drained the joy from crowded streets, and created an atmosphere of perpetual dread. The Ministry was powerless to stop them, because they had never truly understood how to control them. The Death Eaters used these non-human allies to spread despair in ways that human magic could never replicate. A werewolf could turn your neighbor into a monster. A giant could flatten your home. But a Dementor could make you forget why you were fighting. It could sap the will of entire communities, leaving them hollow and compliant. The Death Eaters did not need to conquer every street. They only needed to make resistance feel futile, and the Dementors were perfect for that. The strategic importance of controlling the wizarding world's monsters cannot be overstated. The Giants gave the Death Eaters raw power, a blunt instrument that could break any physical barrier. The Dementors gave them psychological domination, a tool that could break any spirit, and together they created a campaign of terror that no conventional army could counter. The Ministry scrambled to erect wards, to train Patronuses, to negotiate with foreign magical authorities, but none of it mattered. The monsters were already on Voldemort's side, and there were others. The Death Eaters courted the werewolves, promising them freedom from persecution. They sought out the acromantulas of the Forbidden Forest, offering them territory and prey. They even made overtures to the remnants of the old magical creatures, the trolls, the hags, the vampires. Not all of these alliances held. Some creatures were too wild to control, but even the ones who refused to join were neutralized, no longer a threat to the Death Eaters' operations. By the time the Ministry fell, Voldemort had built an army that was not limited to wizards. He had gathered all the dark, forgotten, and feared things of the magical world and bent them to his will. The Giants marched beside dark wizards. The Dementors floated above the streets, and the very idea of resistance began to seem impossible. But even the greatest monster armies must eventually face a final battle, and in the shadows of that long war, a small group of students, teachers, and Order members was preparing to make the last stand. The creatures would be there, the Death Eaters would be there, and at the center of it all, a boy who had already died once would walk into the Forbidden Forest to meet his fate. That moment, the final siege, the battle for Hogwarts, was coming, and nothing could stop it. The Giants had been marshaled, their lumbering forms a promise of brute destruction, and the Dementors had been unleashed to sweep the skies in a silent, suffocating tide. But these were only the opening moves in a war that had long been brewing. And now, in the early hours of the 1st of May, 1998, the final siege of Hogwarts began. The Death Eaters, under the direct command of Lord Voldemort, had assembled in force. This was not a raid, not an assassination, not a covert infiltration. This was a full-scale military assault designed to crush the last bastion of resistance in Wizarding Britain, and they had come prepared. The castle's ancient wards, woven over centuries by generations of headmasters and magical architects, were formidable. They repelled intruders, prevented apparition within the grounds, and dampened hostile magic. But Voldemort, ever the strategist, had studied these defences through his network of spies, and through the intimate knowledge of Severus Snape, who had walked those halls as headmaster. Snape's betrayal was still unknown to the Dark Lord at this hour, but the intelligence he had provided over the years was already baked into the plan. The wards were not invulnerable. They had weaknesses, and the Death Eaters had brought the tools to break them. The tactical deployment of the Death Eater army against defences began with a careful positioning of forces around the perimeter. Voldemort did not rush. He allowed his followers to surround Hogwarts in a tightening noose, cutting off any hope of escape. The Forbidden Forest, already teeming with dark creatures, became their staging ground. From the shadows, acromantulas emerged, giant spiders bred by Aragog's brood, now loyal to Voldemort after his promises of freedom and feeding grounds. These eight-legged horrors would serve as living battering rams, their chitinous legs scaling the walls, their venom dripping into cracks in the stone. They moved silently, a legion of nightmare. Alongside them, trolls were herded into position. They were not the brightest creatures, but their strength was immense. They carried clubs thicker than a wizard's torso, and they had no fear of magic. A troll could tear through a barricade with sheer force. Voldemort had secured a small army of them from the mountains of Eastern Europe, where they had been kept in captivity by dark merchants. Now they were unleashed, their grunts and roars muffled by the distance and the deadening effects of the wards. The Death Eaters themselves formed ranks behind these monstrous vanguards, their masks gleaming in the moonlight. But the true breakthrough came from dark enchantments. Voldemort had spent the months since his resurrection in 1994 perfecting spells of piercing and unmaking. He cast a curse upon the wards themselves, a focused beam of killing intent that sought out the weave of protective magic. It was a slow, patient dismantling, like a master lockpick working on a vault door. Around him, his inner circle channeled their own power into the assault. Bellatrix Lestrange cackled as her curses splashed against the shimmering barrier, testing its resilience with each impact. Antonin Dolohov, the tall, bearded wizard, carved runes into the earth that bled dark fire, weakening the foundation of the ancient protections. The wards groaned. They flickered. They began to crack. Inside the castle, the defenders felt the tremor through the stone. Professor McGonagall, now acting headmistress, had her own knowledge of the castle's defences, but she knew they could only hold for so long. She ordered the statues and suits of armour to life, mobilising every enchanted protector within Hogwarts. The battlements filled with students who had refused to evacuate, many of them underage but determined. The Order of the Phoenix had arrived. Mad-Eye Moody was long dead, but Kingsley Shacklebolt, Remus Lupin, and Nymphadora Tonks took their places. The Weasley family, minus the injured Arthur, fought side by side, and Molly Weasley, the matriarch, stood ready to defend her children with a ferocity that would later become legend. The chaos of the night descended like a thick fog, and with it came the mounting casualties on both sides. Death Eaters advanced through the broken barriers, their wands firing curses of stunning, killing, and torture. The defenders met them with equal fury. Curses streaked across the grounds like lightning, each one carrying the weight of a life. The acromantulas, driven by hunger and the scent of fear, climbed the walls and burst through windows. Trolls pounded at the main gates, their fists cracking the wood. Inside, Neville Longbottom, who had grown from a timid boy into a fierce leader of Dumbledore's army, rallied the younger students. He carried the sword of Gryffindor, pulled from the sorting hat earlier that night, and his face was set in grim defiance. But the high-ranking duels were where the battle truly turned. Among the Death Eaters, Antonin Dolohov was one of the most feared. He had survived the First Wizarding War, escaped Azkaban, and remained loyal even when Voldemort fell. He was a master of curses, and his signature attack, a purple streak of fire, could kill or maim with a single blow. In the chaos of the entrance hall, Dolohov faced off against several members of the Order. He was relentless, cutting down defenders with brutal efficiency, but his final stand came when he encountered Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks. The duel was savage, fought in the narrow corridors, spells ricocheting off stone walls. In the end, Dolohov fell, but not before landing a mortal blow. The cost of that victory would echo long after the battle. Elsewhere, Bellatrix Lestrange was a whirlwind of madness. She sought out her favourite targets, the Weasleys, Harry Potter, but also anyone who dared to stand against her. She duelled with a savage joy, her laughter piercing the noise of war. She faced several members of the Order in a running battle through the courtyard. Her curses wild but accurate. She seemed untouchable, dancing through the combat, leaving wounded and dead in her wake. But even she could not escape the chaos. The battle had no clear front line. It was a sprawling, desperate melee that stretched from the boathouse to the 7th floor. The dark enchantments Voldemort had used to break the wards now twisted the very air, creating pockets of silence and pockets of screaming wind. The dead and dying lay where they fell. Through it all, the castle itself fought back. Peeves the Poltergeist, for once on the side of the defenders, dropped heavy chandeliers on Death Eater heads. The house elves, led by Creature, emerged from the kitchens with knives and cleavers, attacking the ankles of the invaders. But the tide was uncertain. Voldemort remained outside the walls, watching, waiting for Harry Potter to reveal himself. He had not yet entered the castle, because he knew that the prophecy demanded a final confrontation. He wanted Harry to come to him, to die in front of his army, to break the last hope of the resistance. And Harry did come. He had been hunting Horcruxes, and he knew that Voldemort had unknowingly turned himself into one. With the death of Snape, the truth had been revealed. Harry himself was a Horcrux, and he had to die to destroy the piece of Voldemort's soul within him. He walked into the Forbidden Forest alone, his cloak of invisibility discarded, his friends unaware. He found Voldemort and his Death Eaters waiting, and he let the killing curse strike him. It was the ultimate sacrifice. But it did not end there. The killing curse that should have killed Harry only destroyed the Horcrux within him, leaving him alive, protected by the same ancient magic that had saved him as a baby. When he rose again, Voldemort's army thought they had won. They were wrong. Harry, alive. And the battle restarted with a new fury. Now the Death Eaters, confident in their victory, had let their guard down. The defenders, seeing Harry alive, found a new strength. The tide turned, and in the final chaos, Bellatrix Lestrange faced her end. She had been duelling with Molly Weasley, who had just seen her daughter, Ginny, nearly killed. Molly's fury was absolute. She screamed, "Not my daughter, you bitch," and unleashed a curse that struck Bellatrix squarely in the chest. The fanatical Death Eater, Voldemort's most loyal servant, fell dead. Her body hit the ground, and her laughter finally stopped. But that moment, the death of the fanatic, was just the beginning of the end. Voldemort, enraged, turned his wand on Harry, and in the final duel, in the Great Hall with hundreds of witnesses, Harry's mastery of the Elder Wand, Voldemort's own wand, led the killing curse to rebound. Voldemort crumbled to dust, his body lifeless, his soul fragmented forever. The dark mark on the arms of every Death Eater faded into a mere scar, the magic binding them to their master severed. The Battle of Hogwarts was over. The cost was immeasurable. Dozens lay dead. Fred Weasley, Remus Lupin, Nymphadora Tonks, Colin Creevey, and many others. But the enemy was defeated. The Death Eaters who survived were captured, their power broken. The Age of Terror had ended, and as the sun rose over the broken castle, the survivors began to count their dead and bury their heroes. One story in particular, the tale of Bellatrix Lestrange's final moments, would be told for generations. A reminder that even the most fanatical devotion can be shattered by a mother's love. But that is a story for another night. Up next is Chapter 26, The Death of the Fanatic, Bellatrix's End. We will explore how the most loyal servant of Voldemort met her fate, and what her loss meant for the final collapse of the Death Eater movement. Until then, rest easy. The war is over. The darkness has receded, and the wizarding world begins to heal. The battle for Hogwarts had reached its most desperate hour. The castle walls, once a sanctuary of learning and safety, now echoed with the clash of spells, the roar of giants, and the shrieks of Acromantulus. Voldemort's army had thrown everything at the ancient fortifications. Trolls, dark enchantments, and a tide of Death Eaters that seemed endless. But amidst the chaos, there was one figure who moved through the carnage with a dancer's grace, her laughter cutting through the noise like a blade. Bellatrix Lestrange was not just fighting. She was celebrating. For her, this was the culmination of a lifetime of devotion. The moment when her master's triumph was finally at hand. As the defenders of Hogwarts staggered under the assault, Bellatrix sought out her favourite prey. She had already killed Tonks, the young Auror and mother, with a casual cruelty that spoke of her complete disdain for anyone not pure of blood. Now she turned her attention to the Weasley family, a name she had long despised for their blood traitor ways. She spotted Ginny Weasley, still a student, dueling fiercely but outmatched. And then she saw Molly Weasley, the matriarch, the mother of 7, standing between Bellatrix and her youngest child. This moment, so often overlooked in the grand sweep of the battle, carried a weight that went far beyond a simple duel. Bellatrix represented the ultimate fanatic, someone who had given every part of herself to a cause, who had sacrificed family, sanity, and humanity for the approval of a Dark Lord. She was the truest believer in Voldemort's inner circle, the one who never wavered, never doubted, never questioned. Her devotion was absolute, and in that absoluteness, she had become a symbol of the movement's deepest corruption. Molly Weasley, by contrast, was the embodiment of everything the Death Eaters despised. She was a mother who had raised her children with love, not hatred. She was a woman who had never sought power, never craved status. Her magic was not flashy or cruel. It was practical, protective, and fierce. When she stepped forward to face Bellatrix, she did not do so out of a desire for glory or vengeance. She did it because her daughter was in danger, and there was no force in the world that could stop a mother from protecting her child. The duel was brief but unforgettable. Bellatrix, confident in her superior training and her master's favour, mocked Molly with the same cruel laughter she had used on so many victims. But Molly's spells were not the hesitant charms of a housewife. They were the focused, righteous magic of someone who had fought alongside the Order, who had lost brothers and sons, who had watched her family bleed for this war, with a cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. Molly Weasley struck Bellatrix with a curse that stopped her heart, and in that instant, the fanatic fell. The symbolic importance of this defeat cannot be overstated. Bellatrix was not just Voldemort's best lieutenant. She was his most loyal servant, the one who had endured Azkaban without betrayal, who had stood by him when even Lucius Malfoy wavered. Her death was a message, written in the language of magic, that the true believer archetype within the Death Eater movement had collapsed. If Bellatrix could be killed by a mother defending her child, then no amount of devotion could protect anyone. The ideology that had promised invulnerability to its most faithful had proven hollow. For the other Death Eaters watching, the sight of Bellatrix's body crumpling to the stone floor was a turning point. Many of them had followed Voldemort out of fear or ambition, but a few, like Dolohov and the Carrows, had shared something of Bellatrix's conviction. Now they saw that conviction end in a flash of light from an unexpected source. The inner circle, already shaken by the loss of key members and the relentless assault on the castle, began to fracture. If Bellatrix could die, then no one was safe, not even the most favoured among them. And what of Voldemort himself? He felt the moment of her death, not through the dark mark. He had no need for that connection. He sensed it in the way a master senses the absence of a faithful hound. For a creature so incapable of love, so utterly consumed by his own divinity, the loss of Bellatrix was not a matter of grief. It was a calculation. She had been his most reliable instrument, his sharpest blade. Without her, his army lost its fanatical edge, its willingness to go to any extreme. Her death marked the beginning of the end for the inner circle, because it proved that even the most devoted could not withstand the power of ordinary love, ordinary courage. As the battle raged on around him, Voldemort must have felt a flicker of doubt, though he would never admit it. His Horcruxes were being destroyed, his followers were dying, and now his most loyal servant lay dead at the hands of a woman he had dismissed as insignificant. The psychological impact of Bellatrix's fall reverberated through the Dark Lord's mind like a crack in a mirror. He had built his entire philosophy on the supremacy of power, the irrelevance of love, the weakness of bonds. And yet, here was proof that the very things he despised could destroy his most prized follower. In the aftermath, the defenders of Hogwarts rallied. The death of Bellatrix was a spark that reignited hope. Molly Weasley, still trembling from the encounter, was embraced by her children and her husband. But the war was not over. Voldemort, furious and undeterred, was preparing his final gambit. The battle had reached its zenith, and the Master himself would soon enter the field. The Death Eaters, leaderless in their panic, looked to him for salvation. But the cracks were already spreading, and the fall of the Fanatic had set in motion a chain of events that would lead, inexorably, to the final duel and the Master's fall. The fight had not stopped when Bellatrix Lestrange toppled. Her body hit the stone floor of the Great Hall, and for a split second, a strange quiet fell across that corner of the battlefield. Molly Weasley stood over her, chest heaving, wand still raised, and the sight of her victory rippled outward like a shockwave. The Death Eaters, who had been pressing hard against the defenders, faltered. They had seen their most fanatical, most feared sister-in-arms cut down by a mother who had simply had enough. And if she could fall, then something fundamental had shifted. The air in the hall changed. The darkness that had pressed so thickly around them seemed to thin, just a little, as if the very atmosphere recognized that the tide had turned. And then Lord Voldemort saw her. He saw Bellatrix dead, and he let out a scream of such pure rage that it drowned out the clatter of spellfire. He had lost his most devoted servant, the one who had never wavered, the one who had borne his torture and his absence and his return, with a loyalty that bordered on worship. But rage was not the same as grief. Voldemort did not grieve. He burned, and he turned his attention fully to the boy who had brought him to this moment. Harry Potter stood in the shattered entrance to the Great Hall, surrounded by the bodies of friends and enemies alike. His wand was raised, his glasses cracked, his robes torn. He had seen the final memory of Severus Snape. He knew the truth about his own soul. And he had walked into the Forbidden Forest alone to die. He had let Voldemort strike him down in that clearing, and he had come back. And now, in this hall, under the enchanted ceiling that reflected the dawn sky, the final duel would unfold, not as a battle of armies, but as a confrontation between two wills. The logic of the Elder Wand had always been about power, but not the kind Voldemort understood. He believed that the wand was a weapon, a tool of domination, something to be seized by killing its previous owner. He had chased it across continents, murdered its last keeper, and claimed it from Dumbledore's tomb. He thought he had won, but the wand had never belonged to him. It had transferred its allegiance, not to the hand that tore it from a grave, but to the wizard who had disarmed its true master. And that wizard was Draco Malfoy, defeated months ago in Malfoy Manor by a boy who had wrestled his wand away with nothing more than Expelliarmus. Harry Potter was the Elder Wand's true master, and the wand knew it. Voldemort did not understand that principle. He could not comprehend a magic that worked by loyalty rather than conquest. So when he raised the Elder Wand high and shouted the killing curse, a jet of green light screaming toward Harry, the wand did what it had always been meant to do. It refused to kill its master. The spell rebound travelled back along the same path, and Voldemort's own curse hit him square in the chest. He did not fall like a mortal man. He fell like something that had never been truly alive, a husk of dark magic collapsing in on itself. His body crumpled, his arms flew wide, and the last breath of Tom Riddle left him in a long, silent exhale. And then he was still. In that moment, every Death Eater in the Great Hall felt it. The dark mark on their left forearms, the brand that had burned with Voldemort's anger and pulsed with his presence, suddenly flared white hot. For a fraction of a second, the pain was unbearable, and then it stopped. The mark did not vanish entirely. It had been etched into their skin with blood magic, bound to their very souls. But it changed. The skull and the snake turned pale, then grey, then settled into a permanent scar, a faded remnant of what had once been a badge of terror. It no longer glowed. It no longer summoned. It was dead ink, a reminder of a power that had crumbled. The spellfire stopped. The shouts died away, and the surviving Death Eaters looked around at each other with something they had never shown in public. Fear without hope. Their master was gone. He had not just been defeated, he had been annihilated. His body lay on the stones, and the movement that had terrorized Wizarding Britain for 2 decades had lost its center. There was no one to give orders, no one to rally behind, no Horcrux to bring him back. The The dark pillar of the regime had shattered, and what remained was a scattered collection of men and women who had tied their fortunes to a dead god. The surrender began almost immediately. Some threw down their wands, crying out that they had been under the Imperius curse, even when no one believed them. Others tried to disapparate, only to find the castle's anti-apparition wards still in place. A few made a desperate run for the gates, but the defenders were ready. The Battle of Hogwarts had seen enough death. The survivors were taken into custody, their wands confiscated, their masks torn away. The Great Hall filled with the sound of weeping and the clatter of chains. The Death Eaters who had ruled by fear now looked small, diminished, ordinary. They were no longer an army, they were prisoners. And in that moment, the full weight of the truth descended on everyone who witnessed it. The movement had been nothing without its central figure. Voldemort had built his organization on his own personality, his own terror, his own promise of power. He had allowed no lieutenant to become too powerful, no rival to rise. He had been the sun around which all the lesser bodies orbited, and when he went out, they spun into darkness. The ideology of pure blood supremacy did not die in that hall, not entirely. That poison would linger in whispers and hidden corners for years to come. But the organized force that had given it teeth, the secret army that had marched under the dark mark, was finished. They had no leader, no plan, no purpose except the fading scar on their arms. As the dawn broke over the ruins of Hogwarts, the survivors began the work of counting the dead, tending the wounded, and facing the enormity of what had been won. The war was over, but the peace would not come easily. The trials would begin, the justice would be measured, and the wizarding world would have to reckon with how such darkness had taken root. But that is a story for another night, one that begins not with a final duel, but with the long, slow work of rebuilding what had been broken. And in the quiet that followed, as the last echoes of battle faded, the first questions of reform and accountability began to stir. The dark mark, that skull with the snake for a tongue, had burned on the left forearm of every true Death Eater as a brand of loyalty and fear. But in the moments after Voldemort's final death in the Great Hall at Hogwarts, the mark did not vanish. It did not disappear in a puff of magic or a dramatic flash of light. Instead, it simply faded. The black lines turned grey, then became pale, indistinct scars. For the survivors who bore it, the mark was no longer a signal to be summoned. It was a permanent, unwashable tattoo of a nightmare they had lived through, and now they had to answer for it. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Hogwarts was chaos mixed with a stunned, fragile silence. The castle lay broken, its walls scarred by centuries of magic and one final devastating siege. Bodies lay in the rubble. The living walked among them, numb with exhaustion and grief. But even as the sun rose over the grounds, on that first morning of May in 1998, the machinery of justice was already cranking into motion. The surviving Death Eaters had been rounded up in the Great Hall, or dragged from the tunnels and corridors where they had tried to flee. They were bound, stunned, and held under guard by a ragtag coalition of Order members, Hogwarts staff, and the few Ministry Aurors who had managed to fight their way through the chaos. And standing at the centre of that provisional command was Kingsley Shacklebolt. Kingsley had been a quietly formidable presence throughout the war. As an Auror, he had infiltrated the Ministry during its occupation, feeding intelligence to the Order while maintaining a cover so perfect that even the Death Eater-controlled Ministry never suspected him. He had fought in the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, a duel Death Eaters in the skies above the castle, and had been among the last to stand with Harry in the Forbidden Forest. Now in the aftermath, the wizarding world needed a leader who was both just and ruthless. Kingsley Shacklebolt became the interim Minister for Magic, and he had no intention of letting the old system of leniency and denial repeat itself. The first days of the Kingsley Shacklebolt era were a purge of breathtaking thoroughness. Every department of the Ministry was examined. Every office and desk searched for evidence of Death Eater influence. The Muggle-born Registration Commission, that bureaucratic horror show that had branded thousands of innocent witches and wizards as thieves of magic, was dismantled before the ink on its final decrees had even dried. The employees who had actively enforced the anti-Muggle-born laws were arrested or dismissed. Those who had simply looked the other way were given a chance to testify, to confess, or to resign. Kingsley understood that the rot had gone deep, and that the ministry's own culture of complacency had allowed Voldemort's ideology to flourish. He did not seek revenge, but he sought accountability. And then came the trials. The wizarding justice system had a troubled history with fairness, especially in the aftermath of the First War. After Voldemort's first fall in 1981, the ministry had been quick to throw people into Azkaban without proper hearings, relying on the word of a few confessions and the Imperius curse as an excuse. This time, Kingsley established a new tribunal, one that included representatives from all walks of wizarding life. Hogwarts professors, goblins from Gringotts, centaurs from the Forbidden Forest, and even a few of the more moderate former ministry officials who had resisted the regime. The trials were held in the same courtroom where Harry had once been tried for underage magic. But now the stone walls echoed with a different kind of testimony. The mass imprisonment of the remaining Death Eaters was swift and decisive. Azkaban, that island fortress in the North Sea, had been a place of horror for generations, its guards being Dementors, soul-sucking creatures that fed on despair. But the Dementors had sided with Voldemort, and in the final battle they had been driven away or destroyed. The new Azkaban would be different. Kingsley ordered that the Dementors be removed entirely. No longer would the prison be a place of psychological torture and slow madness. It would become a secure holding facility, guarded by auras, enchanted barriers, and the constant vigilance of the wizarding world. The Death Eaters, who were sentenced to life, men and women like Antonin Dolohov, Walden McNair, the Carrows, and so many others, were taken there in chains. They would spend the rest of their lives in a clean, well-ordered prison, but a prison nonetheless. There were no Dementors to close in on their souls, but there was no escape either. The cells were warded, the walls enchanted to prevent apparition, and the guards were trained to watch for tricks. But not every Death Eater ended up in those cells. The Malfoy family once again managed to avoid prison for a second time. It was a pattern that infuriated many who had lost loved ones to the war. Lucius Malfoy had been a Death Eater from the very beginning, privileged pure blood who had used his wealth and influence to aid Voldemort's first rise. He had been arrested after the disaster in the Department of Mysteries, but he had claimed the Imperius curse and walked free. Then, during Voldemort's second rise, he had allowed his home to become the headquarters for the Dark Lord's operations. His house elf was forced to serve them. His own son, Draco, was coerced into assassination attempts. Yet by the end, when everything was collapsing, Lucius had not fought in the final battle. He had stood in the Great Hall, terrified, watching, and then he and his wife, Narcissa, had slipped away to find their son, who was also terrified, also hiding. The reason the Malfoys escaped punishment was not because of a bribe or a loophole. It was because of Narcissa Malfoy's choice. In the Forbidden Forest, when Harry had walked to his apparent death, Narcissa had been sent by Voldemort to confirm whether Harry was truly dead. She saw his eyes, felt his pulse, and in that moment she made a decision. She lied to Voldemort. She told him that Harry was dead, giving the Order the crucial seconds they needed to regroup. She did this not out of loyalty to the light side, but out of a mother's love for her son. She knew that if Voldemort believed Harry was dead, the battle would end, and Draco could be saved. That one act of love, born from selfishness and survival, became the token of her family's redemption. Harry himself testified on behalf of the Malfoys after the war. He told the tribunal that Draco had been forced into service, that he had not killed anyone, and that Narcissa had saved his life. Lucius, though guilty of many crimes, had been broken by the war. He had lost his influence, his fortune was depleted, and his pride was destroyed. The tribunal, swayed by this testimony, and the recognition that punishing the entire family might cause more harm than good, gave them a lenient sentence, a period of probation, a fine, and a requirement to cooperate with the reconstruction. The Malfoys retreated to their manor, now a shadow of its former grandeur, and lived in quiet obscurity. Many wizards resented the outcome, but in the new spirit of reform, the focus was on punishment for the truly unrepentant, not on vengeance. Beyond the courtroom battles, the long process of de-radicalizing the wizarding community had begun. Kingsley Shacklebolt knew that simply locking up the Death Eaters would not undo the ideological poison they had spread. The belief in pure blood supremacy had been taught for centuries, embedded in families, in children's stories, in the very architecture of the ministry. And so the ministry launched a campaign of education and reconciliation. Mandatory history classes were introduced that taught the true cost of blood purity, including the crimes of the Death Eaters. Public memorials were built for the Muggle-born families who had been murdered. Programs of restitution were created for those who had lost their homes, their jobs, or their identities under the regime. The most controversial part of this de-radicalization was the question of what to do with the children of Death Eaters. Some argued that they bore their parents' guilt and should be watched. Others, and Harry Potter was among the loudest of these voices, argued that children were not responsible for their parents' sins. Hogwarts reopened, and the Sorting Hat sang a new song about unity and healing. The children of Death Eaters were allowed to attend, though they were monitored, and many of them chose to denounce their families publicly. It was a slow, painful process, one that would take years, perhaps generations, to fully succeed. And as the dust settled and the ministry began to rebuild, the dark mark itself became a symbol of something else. The faded scars on the arms of captured Death Eaters were no longer a source of fear. They were evidence of a defeated ideology. But for those who had been marked, the scars remained a daily reminder of what they had done and what they had lost. For the rest of the world, the dark mark became a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to children about the dangers of blind loyalty and the seduction of power. But the story of that symbol, of what happened to the mark after Voldemort fell, and how it haunted the survivors, is a deeper thread that we will follow next time. For now, we let the chapter close, a mystery that had learned its lesson. Kingsley Shacklebolt would serve as minister for many years, and under his leadership, the wizarding world began to heal. Yet the scars of war, like the faded dark mark on a traitor's arm, never fully disappear. And in the quiet moments, when the moon is high over the ruins of the old Azkaban, you can still hear the whispers of those who wore the snake and the skull. They are the ones who remind us that the next chapter, the legacy of the dark mark, is not about what was lost, but about what was left behind. With the ministry purged and the Death Eaters locked away in a Dementor-free Azkaban, the wizarding world took its first shaky breaths of peace. But healing does not mean forgetting, and the most visible reminders of the war were not the rebuilt facades of Diagon Alley or the fresh flowers on the steps of Hogwarts. No, the deepest scars were carried on the flesh of the survivors, on the left forearms of those who had once knelt before Lord Voldemort. The dark mark, once a glowing, summoning emblem of terror, had faded into a dull, greyish scar, yet it remained, a permanent ledger of guilt etched into the skin. For every marked Death Eater who survived the Battle of Hogwarts, that scar was a daily confrontation with the life they had chosen. It could not be removed, not by magic, not by time. It was a stigma that would follow them for the rest of their days. A visible confession that they had been part of the darkness. These scars served a purpose beyond punishment. They became evidence, a permanent record that could never be lied away. In the years following the war, any wizard or witch who had once worn the dark mark found themselves unable to hide from their past. The ministry, under Kingsley Shacklebolt, established a registry of marked individuals, not for vengeance but for accountability. The mere presence of that faded skull and snake was enough to trigger suspicion, to require an explanation, to bar a person from certain roles within the government or education. The dark mark became a social and legal anchor, dragging the marked back to the atrocities they had committed or enabled. And yet it was also a symbol of the war's end, because when Voldemort fell, the mark stopped burning. It no longer throbbed with his commands. It simply sat there, cold and inert, a relic of a dead movement. But the war's legacy was not only written on the arms of the guilty, it was also written in the ideology they had championed. The pure blood supremacy movement, which the Death Eaters had weaponized for decades, did not vanish when Voldemort died. Ideas are harder to kill than Horcruxes. The belief that wizard bloodlines held innate superiority had deep roots in wizarding society, going back centuries before Tom Riddle was even born. The Death Eaters had given it a violent face, but the underlying prejudice was far older and more insidious. In the decades after the war, The cultural impact of that ideology played out in quieter ways. There were still families who refused to let their children marry Muggle-borns. There were still whispers in the hallways of the ministry about who was really pure. The most dangerous part of the pure blood movement was not its army. It was its ability to lurk beneath the surface of polite society, masked as tradition. The children of Death Eaters felt this more acutely than anyone. They inherited not only the names of their parents, but the weight of those names. Draco Malfoy spent the rest of his life living down the legacy of his father, Lucius, who had been a key Death Eater and a symbol of wealthy complicity. Draco himself had been forced into service. But that nuance was often lost on a world that remembered the silver-haired boy who had tried to kill Dumbledore. His son, Scorpius, would later face rumours and slurs at Hogwarts, whispers that he was the product of dark magic or that he carried his grandfather's taint. The Malfoys were far from alone. The children of the Lestranges, the Carrows, and even the children of those who had simply been suspected of sympathy found themselves under a magnifying glass. They had to prove their loyalty to a society that had every reason to distrust them. And yet, some of these children chose a different path. They looked at their parents' sins and recoiled. They became outspoken advocates for reform, for the rights of Muggle-borns, for the preservation of the new order. The very names that had once been feared, Black, Lestrange, Malfoy, became symbols of a cautionary tale. But the question remained, could a name ever be fully cleansed? The wizarding world struggled with that tension between forgiveness and memory. The scars of the Death Eaters were not just physical. They were woven into the fabric of families, into the histories of old houses, into the way the next generation was judged before they even spoke. The most chilling part of the legacy, however, was the knowledge that the ideology remained dormant, not dead. Extremist ideas do not die because their leader falls. They go underground, they adapt, they wait for the right conditions to resurface. In the years after the Second Wizarding War, there were isolated incidents, graffiti of the dark mark on ministry buildings, a few wizards caught sharing pro-Voldemort pamphlets, a resurgence of pure blood rhetoric in certain circles. The ministry's aurors tracked these signs carefully, but they could not police thoughts. The seeds of hatred had been sown deep, and in times of economic hardship or political instability, those seeds could sprout again. The Death Eaters had not been a random gang of villains. They had been the symptom of a systemic rot, and that rot was rooted in fear. Fear of the unfamiliar, fear of losing power, fear of the Muggle world's growth. Voldemort had exploited that fear, but he had not invented it. The pure blood ideology, stripped of its magical trappings, was an old story. A story of people who believed they were superior and who would do anything to protect that belief. The Death Eater movement had given that story a terrifying chapter, but the book was not closed. The most important part of the legacy of the Dark Mark was the lesson that vigilance is eternal. The scar on the arm of every former Death Eater was a reminder of what happens when prejudice is allowed to arm itself with murder. The real legacy, then, was not the faded mark, but the determination of the wizarding world to never let it burn again. That determination would be tested in unexpected ways. The next generation would inherit a world that had been scarred, but also a world that had learned to rebuild. They would have to ask themselves what it meant to be a secret army, not the ones that had terrorized, but the ones that had quietly resisted, the ones that had hidden in plain sight. Because the anatomy of a secret army is not only about the soldiers who march in the open, it is about the network of trust, the code of silence, the infrastructure of loyalty that makes any underground movement possible. And in the aftermath of the Death Eaters, the wizarding world realized that the most dangerous secret army was not the one that gathered in the dark. It was the one that could rise again from within the light. The scars of the Dark Mark were never merely physical. They carried the weight of a generation's trauma, a permanent stain on the skin and the soul of the wizarding world. And yet, as we traced how those faded remnants became symbols of survival, or for some, badges of shame, the question that lingers is not about the marks themselves, but about the structure that put them there, the organization that wielded those marks as a tool of command, a symbol of terror, and a brand of belonging. We have seen the Death Eaters in battle, in defeat, and in the shadows of the aftermath. But to truly understand how such a movement could rise, flourish, and nearly break an entire civilization, we must step back and examine the anatomy of that secret army itself. Not just the battles or the names, but the skeleton beneath the flesh, the ideology, the recruitment, the hierarchy, and the fatal flaw that ensured its collapse. We begin at the root. The Death Eaters were not a spontaneous mob of dark wizards. They were the product of a single, obsessive mind. Tom Marvolo Riddle, who learned early that power flows from the willing submission of others. At Hogwarts, he gathered a circle of admirers, pure-blood sycophants who were drawn to his charisma, his cruelty, and his vision of a world where magical heritage determined worth. This was not yet the Death Eaters, as we know them. It was a cult of personality in its infancy, a seed planted in the fertile soil of prejudice and ambition. The Chamber of Secrets was one early symbol of that ideology, the belief that Salazar Slytherin's lineage was the only true magical bloodline. But the real organization took shape only after Riddle vanished from the public eye, transformed himself into Lord Voldemort, and began the systematic recruitment of a terrorist network. The structure he built was deceptively simple. At its core was the inner circle, those who bore the dark mark on their left forearms, a brand that was both a badge of honor and a leash. These were the trusted, the fanatical, the ones who had proven their loyalty through acts of unspeakable violence. Bellatrix Lestrange, Lucius Malfoy, Antonin Dolohov, and others formed the backbone of Voldemort's command. They knew his plans, carried out his most sensitive missions, and were expected to die rather than betray him. Around them swirled a wider web of supporters. Death Eaters who were not quite inner circle, but still willing to torture, murder, and intimidate for the cause. And beyond them, the sympathizers, the financiers, the ministry officials who looked the other way, and the terrified masses who gave information or shelter, because refusal meant death. This was not a traditional army. There were no ranks, no uniforms in the military sense, no supply lines. The Death Eaters operated more like a modern terrorist network, with cells that could be activated or hidden as needed. The dark mark itself served as a communication device. When Voldemort touched his own mark, every branded follower felt the burn and knew they were summoned. It was a system of instant mobilization, impossible to intercept, and utterly dependent on the Master's will. That dependency was both the movement's strength and its greatest vulnerability. For all their talk of pure blood supremacy, the Death Eaters were nothing without their leader. They were a cult of personality, and when the personality vanished, as it did in 1981, the organization shattered, but it did not die. That is the chilling lesson of the Death Eater's anatomy. Fear and prejudice, once organized into a movement, do not simply evaporate when the figurehead falls. The ideology remains, hidden in the hearts of those who believed, waiting for a spark. When Voldemort returned in 1994, the network re-emerged from the shadows with shocking speed. Old members came forward, some claiming they had been under the Imperius curse, others proudly bearing their marks. The second rise was more insidious than the first, because the Death Eaters had learned from their earlier failure. They no longer relied solely on open terror. They infiltrated the ministry, manipulated the press, and used the very institutions of wizarding society to achieve their goals. By 1997, they had effectively conquered Britain without a single pitched battle. The ministry fell not to a siege, but to a whisper campaign of corruption and fear. This is the anatomy of a secret army at its most dangerous. When an extremist movement understands that political control is more effective than random violence, it becomes a threat that cannot be defeated by dueling alone. The Death Eaters' methods evolved over the decades, from the guerrilla tactics of the First Wizarding War to the psychological warfare of the Second. From assassination to occupation, they used the Imperius curse to turn friends into puppets. They tortured families to silence resistance. They spread propaganda that made even the innocent question their own loyalties. The term Death Eater was meant to terrify, and it did. But the true horror was how ordinary it all felt. Wizards who had never raised a wand in anger found themselves cooperating, not because they believed, but because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. And yet, for all its power, the Death Eaters carried the seeds of their own destruction. Their ideology was built on a lie. That blood purity determines magical strength. The most powerful wizard of the age was Harry Potter, a half-blood. Voldemort himself was the son of a muggle and a witch. The movement's internal logic was a paradox that required constant denial. Moreover, the cult of personality that held the Death Eaters together also made them brittle. When Voldemort killed his own followers for failure, when he demanded absolute obedience without question, he created an army of yes-men who were incapable of independent thought. In the final battle, when Voldemort fell, the Death Eaters did not rally. They scattered like leaves before a storm. The dark mark, which had once burned with power, faded to a dull scar. The secret army had no purpose without its master. There is an enduring mystery in the dark arts, a seductive promise of power that has tempted witches and wizards for centuries. The Death Eaters represent the ultimate price of that pursuit, the loss of humanity, the sacrifice of love, the hollowing out of the soul. Voldemort sought immortality, but what he created was an organization that mirrored his own emptiness. His followers were not comrades, they were tools, and tools can be discarded. As we reflect on the secret army that nearly broke the wizarding world, we must remember that the Death Eaters were not monsters from another realm. They were people, witches and wizards who chose fear over courage, prejudice over understanding, and power over connection. Their anatomy is a warning. It shows us how easily fear can be organized, how quickly prejudice can become policy, and how even a small number of determined extremists can cast a shadow over an entire society. The lesson is not ancient history. It resonates now, in every era, in every place where the easy answer of hatred is offered instead of the hard work of empathy. The Death Eaters failed because their foundation was built on a lie, and because there were always those who refused to bend. The Order of the Phoenix, the students of Hogwarts, the ordinary witches and wizards who stood up in the darkest hours. They proved that a movement of love and courage, though often slower and more uncertain, can outlast a secret army. The scars of the Dark Mark remain, but they are now just scars. The story of the Death Eaters is a story of a rise, a long reign of terror, and an ultimate failure. But it is also a story of resilience, of the choice to fight even when the odds seem insurmountable. That choice is the true magic that no Horcrux can replicate and no secret army can destroy. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content.